Adventure Time has never been particularly interested in making Ooh a world where every creature fits neatly into a category. You can have a talking dog living next door to a candy person, an ancient cosmic entity appearing inside someone's dream, a giant monster sleeping beneath a city, and a completely ordinary looking animal that turns out to be far more disturbing than it first appeared. The strange part is that none of this feels especially unusual to the people who actually live there. Finn and Jake can walk into a room and meet something that looks like it should belong in a horror movie, and their first reaction is usually to ask what it wants rather than why it exists. That casual attitude is one of the reasons the creatures of Adventure Time are so memorable. Because the show rarely treats weirdness as something that needs to be explained immediately, one of the best examples is the snail, a character so small that you could easily miss him while watching an episode for the first time. He appears throughout the series in different locations, usually somewhere in the background, and often seems completely irrelevant to whatever Finn and Jake are doing. Eventually, however, viewers begin noticing that the same little snail keeps turning up, and that turns him from background decoration into one of the show's recurring visual jokes. His importance isn't that he has some massive secret history or that he suddenly becomes a major character. Instead, the joke works because Adventure Time has trained its audience to pay attention to tiny details. Once you know the snail is there, you start looking for him, and a character who was originally almost invisible becomes part of the experience of watching the show. That idea becomes much more important when you start looking at creatures that actually do have a connection to the larger mythology. The cosmic owl, for example, initially looks like another bizarre character that Adventure Time could have invented purely for a joke. He is an enormous owl associated with dreams, and his appearances are connected to events that have consequences far beyond whatever dream he happens to enter. The show doesn't give us a traditional introduction explaining his species, his biology, or where he lives. Instead, the cosmic owl simply exists as part of a larger supernatural system that the characters gradually encounter. Later episodes make it clear that dreams, reincarnation, and destiny are not completely separate ideas in Adventure Time, which means that a strange creature appearing inside a dream can actually be connected to the fate of an entire character. The cosmic owl is especially interesting because Adventure Time refuses to make him feel like a normal character. He doesn't spend his time explaining the rules of the universe to Finn, and he isn't presented as someone who knows everything and is waiting to give the audience answers. His appearances are brief and often strange, but they become more meaningful once you understand what else is happening around them. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the series. Adventure Time will introduce a creature that seems almost random, give you a few pieces of information about it, and then trust you to remember those details when they become relevant much later. The Lich takes this approach in a much darker direction. When he first appears, he looks like a traditional undead villain, but that description doesn't really capture what makes him frightening. The Lich is not simply a skeleton who happens to be powerful. His entire purpose is tied to the destruction of life, and his existence reaches back to the ancient history of Ooh and the catastrophe that transformed the planet. He has survived for an enormous amount of time, and unlike many villains in the series, he doesn't seem particularly interested in ruling anything. There is no kingdom he wants to build and no personal revenge story that explains his actions. His goal is much simpler. He wants life to end. That makes the Lich unusual within Adventure Time's already strange collection of monsters. Most villains still behave like people because they want something that people normally want. They want power, recognition, revenge, freedom, or control. The Lich doesn't really fit that pattern because destruction is the objective itself. Even his appearance reinforces this idea. He looks less like a living creature and more like the remains of something that should already be dead, which makes it difficult to think of him as an ordinary member of any species. When he takes control of Billy's body, the distinction becomes even clearer because the Lich's identity can exist independently of the physical body we associate with him. That ability to separate a creature's identity from its body is important, because Adventure Time repeatedly challenges the assumption that someone's appearance tells us what they actually are. The Ice King is one of the clearest examples. For much of the early series, he appears to be a strange magical villain with a blue beard, a crown, an army of penguins, and an obsession with kidnapping princesses. Then, the series reveals Simon Petrikov, the human being who existed before the crown gradually destroyed his memories and personality. Suddenly, the character who looked like a ridiculous fantasy villain becomes something much more complicated. He isn't simply an eccentric wizard, he's the result of a human mind being slowly transformed by an artifact that he originally found without understanding what it would eventually do to him. That transformation also changes the way we understand the creatures around him. The penguins following the Ice King are funny because they behave like his strange little servants, but even they exist inside a world where appearances can hide unexpected histories. Gunter, in particular, seems like an ordinary penguin for much of the series, until the show reveals that the name Gunter is connected to something far more significant. The character's true nature is tied to Orgolorg, an ancient cosmic entity that had been hiding inside the body of a penguin. What began as one of the show's simplest jokes eventually becomes connected to a being that came from outside of Ooo and once posed a serious threat to the planet. That reveal is a perfect example of how Adventure Time uses comedy to hide its mythology. If Gunter had first appeared as a gigantic cosmic monster surrounded by ominous music, viewers would immediately understand that he was important. Instead, he is a small penguin who follows the Ice King around and occasionally behaves strangely. The joke comes first, and the mythology comes later. When the truth is finally revealed, earlier scenes suddenly become more interesting because the audience realizes that this ridiculous little character was hiding something much bigger than anyone expected. Another creature that demonstrates how unpredictable Ooh can be is Shelby, Jake's tiny worm companion. Shelby lives inside Jake's viola and is capable of speaking, thinking, and interacting with the outside world despite being tiny enough to fit inside an instrument. The show doesn't spend much time explaining the biology of this arrangement, and that is part of the joke. In most fantasy worlds, a talking worm living inside someone's musical instrument would be treated as an extraordinary discovery. In Adventure Time, it is basically just another part of Jake's life. Shelby can have conversations, become involved in adventures, and eventually develop his own story without the existence of a tiny, intelligent worm requiring a major explanation. The Candy People take this same idea and turn it into an entire civilization. At first, the concept is simple enough to understand. Princess Bubblegum rules a kingdom populated by living pieces of candy. But the longer you spend in the Candy Kingdom, the stranger that idea becomes. These characters aren't just animated food walking around for visual comedy. They have jobs, personalities, relationships, memories, fears, and political lives. Cinnamon Bun can develop as a person. Mr. Cupcake can have his own identity. And Peppermint Butler can become involved in magic that has very little to do with the harmless appearance suggested by his name. Peppermint Butler is especially important because he demonstrates another recurring feature of Adventure Time's creatures. The appearance of innocence can be completely misleading. He looks like a small candy servant, but he has a deep interest in dark magic and possesses knowledge that seems completely disproportionate to his cheerful appearance. The show uses that contrast for comedy, but it also reinforces the idea that Ooh cannot be understood by looking at characters from the outside. A creature's design tells you what it looks like. It doesn't necessarily tell you what it is capable of doing. This becomes even stranger when Adventure Time starts introducing creatures that don't seem to belong to any familiar category at all. Party God, for example, is essentially a supernatural party creature whose existence makes more sense as a piece of Adventure Time's absurdist mythology than as part of any traditional fantasy ecosystem. He doesn't need to fit into the normal food chain, and he doesn't need a realistic explanation for why he exists. He is simply one of the beings that occupy this world. The important thing is that the series can place a character like Party God next to genuinely terrifying entities such as the Lich, without treating either one as a contradiction. That mixture of comedy and horror is one of the defining characteristics of Ooh. A creature can be ridiculous in one episode and become important to the mythology in another. A character can look harmless but possess supernatural abilities, while another can look terrifying and turn out to have a surprisingly human history. The result is a world where the audience has to keep adjusting its expectations. You can't assume that a funny character is unimportant, and you can't assume that a frightening creature is simply a monster that needs to be defeated. The deer from No One Can Hear You demonstrates the other side of this idea. At first, the deer appears to be an ordinary animal, which should make him one of the least interesting creatures in Ooh. Instead, the episode gradually makes him unsettling through behavior rather than appearance. The strange way he moves and the disturbing implications surrounding him turn something familiar into something that feels completely wrong. Adventure Time doesn't need to transform him into a giant monster, because the uncomfortable part is realizing that something that looks normal isn't behaving normally. That same principle appears throughout the series, and it explains why the strangest creatures aren't necessarily the largest or most powerful ones. The weirdness often comes from discovering that something doesn't belong where you thought it did. A penguin can secretly be a cosmic entity. A wizard can actually be a transformed human. A tiny worm can have a life inside an instrument. A candy person can practice dark magic. An animal can become disturbing without changing its appearance at all. And the tiny snail can keep appearing in the background until you begin wondering if there is more to the joke than you initially realized. The deeper you go, the more these creatures reveal about the world itself. Ooh isn't governed by one consistent explanation for life. Some creatures are connected to magic, others to the remnants of the old world, and others seem to exist because of supernatural forces that the series only explains gradually. Reincarnation complicates the idea of individual identity, while possession and transformation make physical bodies unreliable as a way of understanding who someone really is. The result is a world where the question, "What is that creature?" can have several different answers depending on whether you're asking about its body, its origin, its soul, or the forces that created it. And that's what makes the creatures of Ooh more interesting than a simple list of strange monsters. They're clues to the rules of the world, even when those rules aren't explained directly. Once you notice that, the background of Ooh starts becoming much more important. The places these creatures come from, the environments they inhabit, and the remnants of civilizations scattered across the landscape can tell us just as much about the world as the characters themselves. In fact, some of the strangest creatures only make sense when you understand the strange places that produce them. And that leads into the next part of the story, because Ooh isn't just filled with unusual life, it's filled with locations that seem to operate according to completely different rules, and some of those locations have been sitting in the background of the series for years without ever receiving a full explanation. One of the reasons Adventure Time can support so much lore is that the show rarely gives you the entire explanation for anything at once. A character can mention something in passing during one season, disappear for several years, and then return with a piece of information that completely changes what the earlier scene meant. An ancient ruin might look like nothing more than background scenery, until another episode reveals that it belonged to a civilization that existed before the Mushroom War. Even the basic question of where certain characters came from can remain unanswered for a surprisingly long time. Adventure Time doesn't always treat its mysteries like traditional mysteries, with a clearly defined beginning and end. Instead, they are scattered throughout the series, and understanding them often means putting together details that were never originally presented as part of the same story. One of the biggest examples is the question of what actually happened to the world before Finn's time. From the beginning, Adventure Time makes it clear that Ooo is not a normal fantasy kingdom that has simply existed forever. There are ruins, abandoned cities, old technology, mutated creatures, and references to a civilization that clearly existed long before the Candy Kingdom or the Ice Kingdom. At first, these details can look like random pieces of world building, but eventually the series reveals the Mushroom War. The war was a nuclear catastrophe that destroyed much of the old human civilization and fundamentally changed the planet, leaving behind the strange world that Finn eventually grows up in. The important mystery isn't simply that a war happened, but how much of the world was affected by it, and how many of the strange things Finn encounters are actually consequences of something that happened thousands of years earlier. The Mushroom War also creates one of the most interesting contrasts in the entire series. Finn grows up in a world where the old civilization has almost completely disappeared from everyday life, yet evidence of it is everywhere. He can explore a ruined building without necessarily understanding what it was used for, and the audience can recognize objects as pieces of modern technology, even when the characters treat them as mysterious artifacts. This gives Ooo a strange historical depth because the world isn't merely populated by fantasy creatures. It is a post-apocalyptic civilization that has developed on top of the remains of another civilization. The candy castles and wizard towers are not replacing an ordinary medieval world. They exist alongside the buried remains of a technological society that destroyed itself. That raises another question. How much does anyone in Ooo actually remember about the world before the Mushroom War? Simon Petrikov provides part of the answer because he lived before the catastrophe and survives into the distant future through the effects of the Ice Crown. But Simon is unusual precisely because he remembers the old world personally. For most characters, that history has become mythology, archaeology, or something they don't think about at all. This creates an enormous gap between what the audience eventually learns and what ordinary people in Ooo know. Finn can walk through the remains of human civilization without realizing that humans once built those places, because the history has been separated from the people who created it. Finn's own origins become another major mystery, because he is introduced as apparently being the only human in Ooo. For a long time, the series gives us almost no explanation for where he came from. That makes his search for other humans feel like a search for something much larger than a missing family member. If humans disappeared from Ooo, then finding another human could potentially tell Finn what happened to his species and why he ended up growing up without them. The eventual discovery of Finn's mother, Minerva, and the story of the human colony on the island answers some of those questions, but they also make Finn's childhood stranger. Humans did survive the Mushroom War, but they largely withdrew from the mainland, creating a civilization that Finn knew almost nothing about. Even then, the story leaves interesting questions behind. Finn's existence isn't simply the result of humans surviving on an island. His parents left that community, and Finn was eventually separated from them before being raised in Ooo. Finn's father, Martin, becomes particularly important because he gives Finn a biological connection to the human world, while simultaneously failing to provide the emotional explanation Finn wants. Finding his father doesn't solve Finn's identity crisis. In some ways, it makes it more complicated, because Finn discovers that knowing where you came from doesn't necessarily tell you who you are. Another mystery that becomes increasingly important is the nature of reincarnation in Adventure Time. Early in the series, reincarnation isn't necessarily presented as a central rule of the universe. Later, however, characters such as Finn and Shoko reveal that souls can return in different bodies across different eras. This changes the way the audience can interpret the history of Ooo, because certain relationships may not be isolated events. A character who appears to be completely new can potentially carry connections to someone from thousands of years earlier. That doesn't mean every similar character is automatically a reincarnation of someone else, but the possibility changes how we interpret repeated patterns throughout the series. The relationship between Finn and Shoko is one of the clearest examples. Shoko lived long before Finn, and the episode involving her reveals that her story is connected to Finn's life in a way that is both literal and symbolic. Finn doesn't simply learn about an ancient character from a history book, he discovers that he is connected to her through reincarnation. Suddenly, the world becomes much larger than Finn's individual lifetime. His story is part of a chain that stretches backwards through different versions of Ooh, meaning that some of the events we watch may have echoes that existed centuries before Finn was even born. This also leads into the mystery surrounding Shermie and Beth, the characters who appear in the distant future after Finn's era. They look nothing like Finn and Jake, but Shermie's behavior and role strongly resemble the kind of heroic partnership we associate with them. Adventure Time doesn't need to state every detail, because the implication is already enough to make the future feel connected to the past. The question of what happens after Finn and Jake's era is another mystery in itself. We know that Ooh continues to exist for a very long time, but we don't get a simple chronological history explaining every century between the finale and the distant future. Instead, we see fragments. Civilizations rise and disappear, technology changes, characters are remembered or forgotten, and new versions of familiar ideas emerge. The world becomes a place where history seems to repeat itself without necessarily repeating in exactly the same form. Then there is the question of Prismo and the Time Room. Prismo introduces an entirely different scale to Adventure Time's universe because he demonstrates that the world isn't limited to one straightforward timeline. The time room exists outside normal reality, and Prismo can grant wishes that alter reality in ways that have enormous consequences. When Finn makes his wish regarding the Lich, the result is not simply a normal alternate ending. It creates a different version of reality, and the series later explores the consequences of that altered timeline through Farm World. That raises a much bigger question about how many versions of Ooh actually exist. If a wish can create or alter a timeline, then the world Finn lives in is only one possible version of events. Farm World demonstrates what Ooh might have looked like if the mushroom bomb had not been stopped in the same way. The Ice King is absent, the world is dramatically different, and Finn grows up under completely different circumstances. Yet, this alternate reality isn't presented as meaningless. It exists as another branch of the universe with its own history and consequences. The Lich makes the situation even stranger because his existence is not restricted to a single version of reality. His consciousness and goals can persist across different circumstances, suggesting that certain beings operate on a level that isn't completely tied to one timeline. This becomes especially important when the series explores the multiverse and the relationship between different versions of reality. Suddenly, questions about individual characters become questions about the structure of existence itself. Another major mystery is the origin of the elementals. Characters such as Patient Saint Pym, Slime Princess, Flame Princess, and Princess Bubblegum are connected to elemental forces that existed long before the current kingdoms of Ooh. The elementals reveal that some of the world's fundamental forces can take physical form and pass through different incarnations. This is particularly interesting because it means that the history of Ooh isn't only shaped by human civilization and the Mushroom War. There are supernatural systems operating on a much older timescale, and those systems continue to influence characters thousands of years later. Princess Bubblegum herself creates another mystery because her apparent age doesn't match the history we eventually learn about her. She is not simply a young princess who somehow became powerful enough to rule an entire kingdom, Bonnibel existed long before Finn, and her relationship with Nettie, Gumbald, Chiclay, and the early Candy Kingdom reveals that the history of the Candy People is much more complicated than the cheerful kingdom seen in the early seasons. Her scientific knowledge, longevity, and ability to create life make her one of the most unusual beings in Ooh, even though she looks like one of the most ordinary characters in the main cast. The same can be said for Marceline. Her history connects several completely different eras of Ooh. She is the daughter of Hunson Abadir, survived the aftermath of the Mushroom War, lived through the ruined world before the kingdoms fully developed, and eventually became the Vampire Queen. Her existence creates a bridge between the old human civilization and the supernatural world that develops afterward. Marceline is therefore not simply an immortal character with a long backstory, she is a living record of Oo's transformation. And that may be the most important pattern behind Adventure Time's biggest mysteries. The answers are rarely isolated. Discovering what happened to one character often answers a completely different question about the world. Learning about Simon explains the Ice King. Learning about Marceline explains what Ooh looked like after the Mushroom War. Learning about the human islands explains Finn's origins. Learning about reincarnation changes how we interpret Finn, Shoko, Shermie, and the recurring cycles of heroism. Learning about Prismo expands the story beyond a single timeline. The show keeps turning individual mysteries into pieces of a much larger picture. And there is still one mystery sitting underneath almost all of them. What exactly happened to Ooh after the Mushroom War that allowed this completely bizarre world to develop in the first place? The answer isn't simply that a nuclear bomb exploded and everything became magical. The series suggests a much longer process involving mutation, magic, supernatural forces, surviving humans, ancient beings, and civilizations that developed long after the old world disappeared. By the time Finn arrives, thousands of years of history have already passed, and most people have no idea how much has been forgotten. That is why Adventure Time's mysteries work so well in the first place. The show doesn't build its world around a single secret that can be solved once and forgotten. Instead, every answer creates another layer of history. You discover where Finn came from, and suddenly you have questions about the human islands. You learn about the Mushroom War, and now you want to know what happened to the survivors. You discover reincarnation, and suddenly the similarities between heroes across different eras become more significant. You discover alternate realities, and the entire idea of a single history becomes much harder to maintain. The mystery of Ooh is therefore not simply about finding one final explanation. It is about realizing that the world Finn thought was normal is built on thousands of years of events he never knew about. And once you start following those connections, some of the show's stories become much darker than they first appeared. A funny episode can contain a reference to death, trauma, or the destruction of an entire civilization without changing its cheerful surface. A character who seems ridiculous can be carrying memories from a previous life, while an ordinary-looking location can be the remains of something that happened thousands of years earlier. Adventure Time constantly hides serious ideas inside stories that look simple on the surface, which is why some of its darkest episodes are also among its most memorable. That is where the next part takes us. The episodes where the series stops merely being strange and starts becoming genuinely unsettling. Adventure Time can be surprisingly difficult to describe as a children's show once you look at some of its darker episodes. The series can spend 10 minutes making jokes about candy people and talking dogs, then suddenly reveal something about death, loneliness, war, or the destruction of an entire civilization without changing its basic tone. What makes these episodes effective is that the darkness usually isn't presented through constant violence or horror. Instead, it comes from the ideas underneath the story, especially when the characters are forced to deal with things they cannot simply defeat with a sword. Sometimes the most unsettling part of an episode is realizing that the strange world Finn has grown up in is full of people who have already lost something they can never get back. One of the clearest examples is No One Can Hear You, an episode that initially feels like a strange little adventure before gradually turning into something much more disturbing. Finn returns to the Candy Kingdom and finds it apparently abandoned, which immediately creates a sense that something is wrong. Instead of discovering a conventional monster attack, he eventually finds Jake in a hospital, behaving in an extremely unsettling way and surrounded by an atmosphere that feels completely different from the usual Adventure Time setting. The episode plays with the idea of isolation very effectively, because Finn isn't simply fighting an enemy, he is trying to understand whether the person in front of him is actually Jake. And the longer the situation continues, the less reliable the world around him seems to become. The deer makes the episode even stranger because it takes an ordinary animal and makes it feel threatening without turning it into a traditional monster. Its behavior is unnatural enough to make the viewer uncomfortable, but the episode doesn't need to explain every detail for the effect to work. Adventure Time understands that familiar things can become frightening when they stop behaving the way we expect. A deer should be harmless, and the hospital should be a place where people are cared for, but the episode changes the meaning of both. The result is an atmosphere that feels almost like a nightmare, even though the animation remains unmistakably Adventure Time. Another episode that uses this approach is the Hall of Egress. On the surface, the story is about Finn becoming trapped in a mysterious underground chamber after losing his vision, but the episode becomes much more interesting when you realize that the challenge isn't really about escaping a physical prison. Finn repeatedly tries to solve the problem through the methods he normally uses, and those methods fail because the situation requires him to change his behavior rather than simply fight harder. He has to walk through the world without being able to rely on sight, and the experience becomes increasingly disorienting because he has no clear explanation for what the hall actually is or why it has appeared to him. The episode is dark in a quieter way because Finn is completely isolated from the people he normally depends on. He can't simply call Jake for help, and there is no obvious enemy that he can defeat. He has to continue moving forward without knowing whether he is making progress at all. That uncertainty gives the episode an unusual psychological quality, especially because Adventure Time doesn't provide a simple explanation for the Hall of Egress. The place feels like a test created specifically for Finn, but whether it is magical, supernatural, symbolic, or something else is left deliberately unclear. Then there is King Worm, which takes the idea of losing control over your own mind and turns it into one of the series' strangest dream sequences. Finn becomes trapped inside a dream that is being manipulated by the King Worm, and the episode repeatedly changes the apparent rules of reality. Characters appear in unexpected places, identities become confused, and Finn struggles to determine which parts of what he's experiencing are real. Dreams are already a recurring source of mystery in Adventure Time, but this episode makes them particularly unsettling because the viewer shares Finn's uncertainty. When the world can change simply because someone is dreaming it, physical strength becomes almost irrelevant. That same fear of losing control appears in some of the Ice King's stories, particularly once the series reveals who he really is. Earlier episodes often use the Ice King as comic relief, but I Remember You completely changes the emotional context of the character. Marceline recognizes Simon, while Simon no longer fully recognizes her because the Ice Crown has taken so much of his memory and personality. The tragedy comes from the fact that the audience understands the relationship even when Simon cannot. Marceline remembers the man who cared for her when she was a child, while the person sitting in front of her is increasingly unable to remember the life they once shared. The episode doesn't need a dramatic villain because the antagonist is essentially time and the gradual destruction caused by the crown. Simon isn't choosing to forget Marceline, he's losing pieces of himself because of something he once used to protect them both. That makes the situation particularly painful because there is no simple solution. Marceline can remember everything for both of them, but she cannot give Simon back the mind he once had. Their relationship becomes a reminder that surviving something does not necessarily mean escaping its consequences. I Remember You also makes the Mushroom War feel more personal. Earlier in the series, the war is primarily an explanation for the ruined world. After learning about Simon and Marceline, however, the audience can understand what the aftermath actually looked like for individual people. Marceline was a child wandering through the ruins of civilization, while Simon was desperately trying to keep her alive. The ruins scattered throughout Wu no longer are just mysterious pieces of scenery. They become evidence of a world where people lived ordinary lives before everything collapsed. Marceline's own past receives an even darker treatment in Simon and Marcy. The episode shows her shortly after the Mushroom War, when she is still a child and the world around her has been devastated. Simon is trying to take care of her while his own mind is gradually being consumed by the crown. The frightening part isn't that monsters are attacking them every minute, it's that the two characters are surviving in a world where basic safety has disappeared, and the person responsible for protecting Marceline knows that he is slowly losing himself. The episode works because the relationship between Simon and Marceline is so ordinary, despite the extraordinary circumstances. He worries about finding food, she gets sick, they argue. They try to make the best of their situation. Those small moments make the apocalypse feel more real than a giant battle ever could. The world has ended around them, but they still have to deal with the same basic problems that people deal with anywhere: keeping someone you love alive, finding shelter, and trying to maintain some sense of normality when everything familiar is gone. Another dark part of Adventure Time comes from No One Can Hear You and similar episodes that temporarily remove the normal safety of the Candy Kingdom. The Candy Kingdom is usually one of the safest places in Wu, which is precisely why it works so well when the show makes it feel empty or threatening. Adventure Time repeatedly uses familiar locations this way. A place that normally represents comfort can become disturbing simply because the characters are suddenly alone there. The viewer already knows the location, so there is no need to explain why it matters. The difference between what the place normally feels like and what it feels like now creates the tension. The comet takes the darkness in another direction by suggesting that the existence of individual characters may be much less important from the perspective of the universe. When Finn encounters the cosmic entity connected to the comet, he is confronted with the possibility that life itself is part of a much larger cycle. The comet isn't simply a rock flying through space. It is connected to reoccurring cosmic forces and to the idea that beings can appear throughout different eras in different forms. Finn is given the opportunity to leave his current existence behind and become something greater, but doing so would mean abandoning the life and relationships he has built. The episode becomes surprisingly philosophical because Finn has to decide whether his individual life is worth preserving when the universe offers him something much larger. He ultimately chooses his existing life, which is important because Adventure Time repeatedly returns to the idea that individual experiences have value even when they are temporary. The darkness isn't that Finn's life is meaningless, it is that nothing guarantees it will last forever, and he has to choose to value it anyway. Death itself becomes an even more direct subject in episodes involving the afterlife. Adventure Time establishes that death is not necessarily the end of existence. Souls can continue, reincarnation can occur, and characters can encounter beings who exist outside the normal physical world. But that doesn't make death less serious. If anything, it creates more questions because the series suggests that there are different levels of existence, different forms of reincarnation, and different consequences depending on how a person lives. Finn's experiences with death are particularly important because he spends so much of the series fighting dangerous creatures without fully considering what death means. When he encounters situations involving souls or the afterlife, the rules suddenly become personal. The viewer starts to understand that the strange supernatural systems operating in Wu aren't just background mythology. They determine what happens to characters after their physical lives end. The darkest episode in Adventure Time may ultimately be Together Again, because it brings many of these ideas together through Finn and Jake's relationship. The story takes place after their deaths, And that premise alone changes the emotional context of everything that happens. Finn and Jake are no longer young adventurers who assume they will always have another quest tomorrow. They have already lived their lives, and the episode asks what happens when even the strongest bond in the series eventually reaches its natural ending. What makes the episode powerful is that it doesn't treat death as a punishment. Finn and Jake are reunited, and their relationship remains recognizable even after death. They joke, argue, and work together the way they always have. But the fact that they are dead is always present in the background. Their adventure is no longer about surviving the next monster or saving the kingdom. It is about accepting that their lives were finite and deciding what they want to do with whatever comes after. That is also why it can feel darker than some of the series' most violent stories. Violence is easy to understand. A monster attacks, the heroes fight back, and the danger is resolved. Death is different because it cannot always be defeated. Adventure Time eventually allows Finn and Jake to confront that reality without turning their final story into something hopeless. Their relationship survives, but it also changes, and the series allows them to move towards different futures rather than pretending that everything has to remain exactly as it was. There are other episodes that become dark through completely different subjects. BMO Lost is mostly playful, but the isolation of BMO in an unfamiliar environment demonstrates how vulnerable the character can be without Finn and Jake. The Creeps uses a murder mystery setup that turns the Candy Kingdom into a temporary horror setting, while Freak City explores transformation and identity through a magical curse that changes the characters' bodies. Even episodes that are primarily comedic can contain uncomfortable ideas when you stop and think about what is actually happening to the characters. That is one of Adventure Time's greatest strengths. The series doesn't need to announce when it is becoming dark. It can simply change the context of something that already exists. A crown becomes tragic when you learn what it did to Simon. A ruined building becomes meaningful when you realize people once lived there. A dream becomes frightening when the dreamer cannot control it. A magical transformation becomes disturbing when the character begins losing their sense of identity. And death becomes emotional when the characters you have followed for years finally have to accept that their adventures cannot continue forever. The darkness of Adventure Time therefore comes more than monsters, violence, or creepy imagery. It comes from the fact that the world has consequences. People disappear, memories can be lost, civilizations can collapse, relationships can change, characters can die, return, reincarnate, or become completely different versions of themselves. The series allows these things to exist alongside jokes and absurd creatures, which is why the darker episodes often become more powerful when you revisit them years later. Once you understand that, some of the show's strangest moments start creating a different kind of problem. Adventure Time isn't always dark because it has a hidden explanation. Sometimes it is dark because the world simply refuses to explain itself completely. Characters survive things that should be impossible, objects behave according to rules that are never fully established, and events that appear contradictory can both be canon at the same time. And that brings us to another category of Adventure Time's weirdness, the things that simply don't seem to make sense, even after you've watched the entire series and know how much mythology is hiding underneath it. Adventure Time eventually gives us enough information to explain many of the strange things we see in Ooh, but that doesn't mean the entire world suddenly becomes logical. In fact, learning more about the series can sometimes make certain details even more confusing. Once you know that the Mushroom War happened, that reincarnation exists, that different timelines can branch off from one another, and that ancient supernatural beings have been influencing the world for thousands of years, you start expecting everything to fit together. Then you notice that some things simply don't. Characters change in ways that are never fully explained. Objects appear to have abilities that don't match anything else in the universe, and the timeline can become difficult to follow even when you know the major events that are supposed to define it. One of the clearest examples is the sheer variety of technology that exists in Ooh. The world contains castles, swords, magical creatures, and medieval-looking villages, but it also contains computers, cars, robots, spaceships, laboratories, video games, and remnants of highly advanced machinery. The Mushroom War explains why much of that technology is left behind, but it doesn't completely explain why some advanced technology continues to function thousands of years later, while other parts of civilization have almost entirely disappeared. Fenn can find an old computer in a ruined building and treat it like a mysterious object, while other characters have access to technology that seems surprisingly sophisticated. Ooh isn't simply a world that forgot modern technology. It is a world where different levels of technological development exist side by side. Princess Bubblegum makes that contradiction even more obvious. She lives in a kingdom that looks like a medieval fantasy society, but she is capable of building robots, conducting scientific experiments, creating artificial life, and developing technology that would be extraordinary even in the old human world. Her laboratory contains equipment that looks closer to a modern research facility than anything else in the Candy Kingdom, yet most of her citizens are living as candy people in what resembles a small monarchy. The explanation is partly that Bubblegum is an unusually advanced scientist who has had centuries to develop her knowledge, but that still leaves a broader question of how much technology she has independently recreated and how much came from the world that existed before the Mushroom War. The strange thing about Ooh is that nobody seems particularly concerned about this technological contradiction. Fenn doesn't usually stop to ask why a princess living in a candy castle has access to advanced scientific equipment. Jake doesn't question why an ancient ruin contains machines that can still operate. The characters simply use whatever technology happens to be available. This works because the show is built around a mixture of genres, but from the perspective of the world itself, it creates a civilization that doesn't follow a normal technological progression. The same problem appears with language and culture. Ooh contains characters who speak modern English, use references that clearly come from contemporary culture, and understand concepts associated with the old human world. At the same time, many communities have developed completely different cultures and social systems that seem to have emerged after the Mushroom War. Some characters know what old human objects are, while others treat them as mysterious artifacts. There is no single point where the old world ended and the new world began. Instead, both cultures seem to overlap across thousands of years of history. Finn himself is a good example of this strange mixture. He grows up in Ooh with almost no knowledge of modern human civilization, yet he is able to interact with technology when he encounters it. He understands concepts that would be completely foreign to someone living in a genuinely isolated medieval society, but he doesn't recognize many of the objects left behind by the old world. His understanding of history is similarly inconsistent, which makes sense for a character who grew up without access to reliable historical records, but it also means that the audience is constantly learning about the past at the same time he is. Another confusing aspect is the geography of Ooh. The series gives us a general idea of where major kingdoms are located, but the actual distances between places can change depending on the story. Finn and Jake can travel for what seems like a very long time in one episode and then arrive somewhere else surprisingly quickly in another. Characters who live far apart can occasionally meet without the journey being treated as a major expedition. This isn't necessarily a continuity error because Adventure Time often operates on a flexible cartoon geography. But if you tried to draw a perfectly accurate map based on every episode, you would quickly run into contradictions. The Candy Kingdom itself seems to move between different kinds of environments depending on the story. The surrounding landscape can be a forest, desert, field, or ruined area, and the distance to other kingdoms doesn't always feel consistent. This makes Ooh feel more like a collection of story environments than a carefully measured continent.
From a storytelling perspective, that flexibility is useful because it allows each episode to have the setting it needs. From a lore perspective, however, it makes the actual geography surprisingly difficult to reconstruct. Time works in a similarly strange way. Adventure Time clearly has a history that stretches back thousands of years, but characters don't always age in ways that would make sense if the series followed ordinary biological rules. Princess Bubblegum is one of the clearest examples, because she has existed for centuries while maintaining a youthful appearance for most of the series. Marceline is also hundreds of years old, yet her physical appearance changes much slower than a normal human's. The Ice King is technically an extremely old human whose body has been altered by magic, while other characters apparently live for very long periods without any clear explanation.
The series eventually gives us enough information to understand some of this. Candy people have unusual biology. Vampires are supernatural beings, and magical artifacts can alter the body. But even with those explanations, the rules are inconsistent enough that it is difficult to establish a universal aging system for Ooh. Some characters age normally, some age slowly. Some can apparently live for centuries, and others can change their physical age through magic or technology. Finn and Jake's own aging makes this even more interesting because the series allows them to grow older while maintaining the basic identities we associate with them. We see Finn become a teenager and eventually a young adult, while Jake's aging is complicated by his magical biology. His body can stretch, transform, and change shape, but his age still progresses. That creates a strange combination where the characters are clearly capable of aging, but are also not governed by the same physical limitations as ordinary humans and dogs. Then there are the magical objects. The Enchiridion is supposed to be a powerful book containing information about heroes, but the rules surrounding it are never completely consistent. It can interact with magical systems, provide information about the multiverse, and serve as part of larger quests, yet the exact origin and limits of its knowledge remain unclear. If the book contains knowledge about heroes across different realities and eras, it raises the obvious question of who created it and how that information was collected in the first place. The Ice Crown has a similar problem, although the series gives us much more information about its history. We know that the crown has existed for a very long time, that its powers are connected to ancient forces, and that its use gradually changes the wearer. But the artifact is still capable of producing effects that seem far beyond what most other magical objects in the series can do. It can alter memories, change physical appearance, generate ice, and eventually become connected to events involving the multiverse. Its exact capabilities depend heavily on the story, which makes it difficult to define where the crown's power actually ends. Finn's sword collection is another example. Weapons in Adventure Time are not simply tools for combat. They can contain souls, personalities, magical abilities, and connections to Finn's identity. The grass sword eventually becomes especially important because it isn't simply a sword that happens to be made of grass. It is connected to a strange magical force that eventually produces Fern, creating one of the most complicated relationships between a weapon and a character in the entire series. The idea that a sword can essentially develop into another version of Finn sounds absurd when you describe it plainly, but within the mythology of Adventure Time, it becomes completely possible. That leads to another thing that doesn't make much sense until you start considering the show's rules. How often characters can transform into completely different forms without losing their identities. Jake's abilities alone create dozens of situations that would be impossible under normal biology. He can make his body enormous, tiny, flat, thin, thick, or shaped like almost anything he wants. Sometimes he can create extremely detailed structures with his body, and other times his transformations appear to follow the needs of the joke rather than a consistent set of physical limitations. Jake's abilities are eventually explained as the result of his unusual origins and magical biology, but even that doesn't fully answer how far his powers extend.
He can manipulate his body in ways that would require enormous amounts of energy, yet the show rarely treats that as a limitation. He can become enormous without becoming impossibly heavy, create complicated shapes without losing control of himself, and sometimes use his body almost like a separate set of tools. The explanation is that Jake is Jake, but that doesn't really explain the physics. The same flexibility applies to Princess Bubblegum's ability to create life. Her candy people are biological organisms, but they are also the products of her scientific experiments and magical world. She can create new candy beings, alter existing ones, and develop artificial organisms that become independent people. That raises questions about where the boundary between science and magic actually exists in Ooh. Bubblegum often describes her work scientifically, but some of the results would be impossible even under the most advanced technology available in the old human world. Then there is magic itself, which may be the biggest source of inconsistency in the series. Magic can do almost anything, but its rules depend heavily on the character using it. Some spells have very specific requirements, while others seem to work simply because the story needs them to. Wizards can transform people, summon creatures, manipulate dimensions, alter memories, and sometimes even interfere with souls. Yet there is no single magical system that explains all of these abilities. This becomes especially noticeable when different magical characters interact. Ice magic, fire magic, dark magic, elemental power, cosmic abilities, and wish magic all operate according to different rules. That doesn't necessarily mean the universe is inconsistent, because Adventure Time may simply contain several different supernatural systems. But the series rarely gives us a complete explanation of how those systems interact, which leaves plenty of unanswered questions. One of the strangest examples involves wishes. Prismo can grant wishes that fundamentally alter reality, but the consequences of those wishes can become extremely complicated. When Finn makes his wish about the Lich, the resulting timeline demonstrates that changing one event can create an entirely different world. Yet the series doesn't treat every possible wish as an unlimited solution to every problem. There are rules surrounding the time room, Prismo's abilities, and the way wishes are interpreted, but those rules aren't always obvious until a specific situation requires them. This creates a strange situation, where the universe contains something close to reality-altering power, but the characters rarely use it to solve every problem. Part of that is explained by the fact that most characters don't have access to Prismo, and another part comes from the restrictions of the wishes themselves. Still, once the audience understands that a wish can create an alternate timeline, it becomes difficult not to wonder why certain problems aren't approached through the same system. The multiverse itself creates even more confusion. Farm World proves that alternate realities can exist, while other stories introduce different versions of familiar characters. The series eventually goes much further with this concept, especially when it explores beings who exist across multiple realities. But if there are potentially countless versions of Ooh, then the history we follow isn't necessarily the only version of events. The character's death might be permanent in one reality and completely different in another. A world-ending event might happen in one timeline and be prevented in another. Even Finn's life becomes one possibility among many. The strange part is that the characters don't constantly think about this. For Finn, the reality he lives in is still his reality. Knowing that another version of himself exists doesn't make his own experiences less important. In fact, Adventure Time eventually uses the multiverse to explore the opposite idea. Even if infinite versions of a person exist, the individual choices made by one version can still matter. There are also smaller contradictions that become funny once you start noticing them. Characters can survive injuries that would be catastrophic in one episode and suffer much more ordinary consequences in another. Buildings can be destroyed and later appear perfectly intact. Objects can disappear from the story for years and then return as though they had always been available. characters who should logically recognize each other sometimes don't, while characters who have never met seem to know exactly who they're talking about. These inconsistencies are part of the nature of Adventure Time. The show wasn't designed as a perfectly rigid encyclopedia where every object and event had to obey the same mathematical rules. It was built around storytelling, experimentation, comedy, and increasingly ambitious mythology. As the series became more serialized, earlier details sometimes gained new meanings that weren't necessarily planned when they first appeared. That doesn't make the world less interesting. In some cases, it makes it more interesting, because Adventure Time's world feels less like a machine and more like a collection of stories that have accumulated over time. Some details are carefully connected, others are jokes. Some contradictions probably exist because the writers wanted to serve the episode they were making rather than maintain a perfect timeline. And occasionally, something that looks like a contradiction turns out to have an explanation hidden somewhere else in the series. The important thing is that not every strange detail needs to be solved. Sometimes the fact that ooh doesn't completely make sense is part of why it feels alive. A world where every rule is explained can eventually become predictable. Adventure Time leaves enough unexplained that the viewer can keep asking questions, even after the main story is over. And that brings us back to the larger idea behind all of this. The creatures, mysteries, dark episodes, and contradictions aren't separate categories. They overlap constantly. A strange creature can reveal an ancient part of Oo's history. A mysterious location can lead to a question about reincarnation. A seemingly harmless magical object can become connected to a character's identity. An inconsistency can turn into a clue that the universe operates according to rules we haven't fully understood yet. The more you investigate Adventure Time, the harder it becomes to separate the weird parts from the important ones. Because in Ooh, weirdness is often the first sign that there is a much larger story underneath it.
If you try to map Adventure Time using only the locations that appear in the opening credits, you would get a fairly simple picture of Ooh. There is the Kingdom, the Ice Kingdom, the Fire Kingdom, the Tree Fort, and a collection of forests, mountains, caves, and villages scattered between them. But that map would leave out some of the most interesting places in the entire series. Adventure Time constantly introduces locations that seem to exist outside the normal geography of Ooh, and many of them don't follow the same rules as ordinary places. Some are hidden underground, some exist inside dreams or other dimensions, and some appear to be connected to forces that are much older than the kingdoms Finn knows. The dungeon, for example, is one of the earliest signs that Ooh has a much stranger geography than Finn's everyday adventures suggest. Finn and Jake enter it expecting the usual collection of traps and monsters, but the dungeon itself feels almost like a world contained inside the world. There are rooms that shouldn't logically fit inside the structure, creatures that appear to have been living there for years, and magical objects that seem to exist specifically to test anyone who enters. The important detail is that nobody seems to know who built the entire place or why so many dangerous things were gathered there. Finn treats it like an adventure location, but from a world-building perspective, it raises the question of how many other hidden environments exist beneath the surface of Ooh. The Nightosphere is even stranger because it isn't simply a distant location, it is another realm entirely. And its existence reveals that Ooh is connected to places that operate according to completely different rules. Hunson Abadir rules the Nightosphere, and Marceline's connection to him gives the realm a personal significance that goes beyond its appearance as a demonic dimension. The Nightosphere is filled with beings that resemble demons, but the realm itself isn't simply a traditional version of hell. It has its own society, its own ruler, and its own relationship with the living world. Characters can travel between the two realms, but doing so requires specific magical circumstances, which makes the boundary between Ooh and the Nightosphere feel more like a genuine border between different realities.
What makes the Nightosphere particularly interesting is that it existed before Finn ever encountered it. Marceline's father was already ruling there, and Marceline herself had a connection to the realm long before she became part of Finn and Jake's adventures. That means the supernatural side of Ooh isn't something that appeared after the Mushroom War. It has its own history, and some of its most important beings have been around for much longer than the kingdoms that dominate the modern landscape. The Mushroom War changed the world dramatically, but it didn't create every strange thing in it. The same becomes true when Finn enters the Time Room. Unlike the Nightosphere, the Time Room isn't simply another place on the map. It exists outside ordinary time, and Prismo lives there as a cosmic, wish-granting being. The room is almost impossible to place geographically because it isn't really part of Oo's physical environment. Finn can't simply walk there from the Candy Kingdom. He needs access to a supernatural system that allows him to enter a space where the normal relationship between past, present, and future doesn't work the same way. The time room changes how we understand the entire setting, because it proves that Ooh is only one part of a much larger universe. Before Prismo, it's easy to think of Adventure Time as a post-apocalyptic fantasy world with some magical elements. After Prismo, that explanation is no longer sufficient. There are places outside the normal flow of time, beings capable of altering reality, and alternate timelines that can branch away from the world Finn knows. The physical landscape of Ooh is therefore only one layer of the setting. The Dead Worlds take that idea even further. Adventure Time's Dead After isn't presented as one simple destination where everyone goes after dying. There are different levels, and souls can move through them depending on circumstances that are not always immediately clear. Finn eventually encounters versions of the afterlife where characters are living in entirely different states of existence, and this makes death feel like a journey through another geography rather than a single event. The strange thing is that these worlds seem to have their own structures and inhabitants, even though they aren't physical places in the normal sense. That becomes especially important when Finn and Jake eventually experience what comes after death. Their story shows that the relationship between life and death and Adventure Time is not straightforward. A character can die, enter another world, reincarnate, and potentially continue existing in a different form. The existence of these places means that death doesn't simply remove someone from the story, it can move them into another part of the universe. The Hall of Egris is one of the best examples of a location that feels almost impossible to classify. Finn enters it while exploring a dungeon-like environment and discovers that leaving requires him to follow a strange set of rules. The hall itself is simple enough in appearance, but the way it interacts with Finn makes it feel like a test rather than a normal room. When he finally escapes, the experience has changed him, and the episode never gives a complete explanation of who created the hall or why it exists. This is important because Adventure Time often uses locations as if they have personalities even when they aren't literally alive. The Hall of Egris seems designed to force Finn into a particular kind of behavior. It isn't merely a physical obstacle, it becomes a challenge that he has to understand rather than overpower. The lack of a definitive explanation makes it more interesting because the viewer has to decide whether the hall is magical, symbolic, supernatural, or simply part of the strange architecture of Ooh. The Chamber of Frozen Blades is another location that demonstrates how little the audience knows about the world's hidden structures. Finn and Jake can encounter environments that seem to have been built for purposes completely unrelated to the kingdoms they know. These places contain ancient weapons, magical mechanisms, and creatures that have apparently survived without interacting with the outside world. Ooh has so many isolated environments that it begins to feel less like one civilization and more like dozens of different worlds overlapping in the same territory. The underworld is another example. Characters can enter underground regions where ordinary geography gives way to strange ecosystems, ancient ruins, and supernatural beings. These environments aren't always connected to the same mythology, which makes it difficult to construct a single explanation for everything beneath Ooh. Some underground areas seem natural, others seem artificial, and others appear to exist because of magic. The result is a planet where going underground can be almost as unpredictable as traveling into another dimension.
Then there are places that are strange because of what happened there, rather than because of how they look. The ruins of the old human world are scattered throughout U, and many of them are effectively frozen moments from a civilization that no longer exists. Finn can enter an abandoned building and find objects that were once completely ordinary to someone living before the Mushroom War. To him, those objects are artifacts. To the audience, they are reminders that U is built on the remains of a world that was once much closer to our own. The old cities are particularly interesting because they show how much history has disappeared. A road can lead nowhere because the city that once used it is gone. A building can remain standing even though nobody remembers who constructed it. A machine can continue functioning long after the civilization that created it has disappeared. These places make the Mushroom War feel less like a piece of background lore and more like an event that physically surrounds the characters. Marceline's memories give these ruins another layer of meaning. She remembers the world before it became the strange landscape that Finn knows, which means that places that seem ancient to Finn were once part of her childhood. She can look at the remains of civilization and remember when they were new. That makes Marceline one of the few characters who can connect the physical landscape of modern U to the people who originally lived there. The same idea applies to Simon. Before becoming the Ice King, Simon traveled through the old world as an archaeologist, studying artifacts that already had historical significance even before the Mushroom War. His research means that some of the objects scattered throughout U have a direct connection to his life. When the audience sees Simon exploring ruins, they aren't simply watching another adventure. They are watching someone who belongs to the world that eventually becomes the ruins Finn explores. There are also locations that exist because of dreams. Dreams in Adventure Time aren't always private experiences that disappear when someone wakes up. They can contain characters, locations, and events that have real consequences. The dream world is difficult to understand because its geography is determined partly by the mind of the dreamer. A person can move through a landscape that reflects memories or fears, while another character can enter that dream and interact with it. This becomes particularly strange when the cosmic owl appears. His presence suggests that dreams are connected to a larger cosmic system rather than being completely isolated mental experiences. If a cosmic entity can appear within someone's dream and interact with the dreamer, then the boundary between imagination and reality becomes much less clear. Adventure Time never gives us a scientific explanation for how this works, and it doesn't need one. The important point is that dreams can contain information about the future and connect characters who might never meet in the physical world. The land of U also contains places that seem to be shaped by specific magical forces. The Fire Kingdom is an obvious example because the environment, architecture, and people are all influenced by fire. But even there, the rules are more complicated than simply saying that everything is made of fire. Flame Princess is a living person with emotions, political responsibilities, and relationships, while the kingdom itself operates like a society. The environment is dangerous to ordinary people, but perfectly normal to its inhabitants. The Fire Kingdom also demonstrates how much a location can influence a character's identity. Flame Princess is not simply a person who happens to live in a hot place. Her powers, personality, family history, and relationship with Finn are all connected to the kingdom. When her emotions become unstable, the environment itself can become dangerous. In U, geography and character are often connected in ways that don't happen in ordinary fantasy settings. The Candy Kingdom works similarly, but in a completely different direction. Almost everything about the environment reflects Princess Bubblegum's influence. The buildings, citizens, technology, and political structure all come from her decisions. This makes the kingdom feel less like a naturally developed society and more like an experiment that has gradually become a civilization. The strange part is that many of the people living there have no idea how artificial their origins actually are. That raises an uncomfortable question about U's kingdoms in general. How many of them were actually created by the people living there, and how many are the result of ancient forces that nobody remembers? The Ice Kingdom, Fire Kingdom, Candy Kingdom, and other major regions all have their own histories,
but those histories don't always connect neatly. Some kingdoms have existed for centuries, while others were created comparatively recently. Beneath them are ruins and supernatural places that are even older. By the time you put all these locations together, U starts looking less like one coherent continent and more like a collection of overlapping realities. A dungeon can contain rooms that seem impossible. A dream can function like a physical environment. The afterlife has its own geography. The night sphere exists beside the living world. The time room exists outside normal time. Ancient ruins sit underneath modern kingdoms, and magical regions operate according to rules that have little connection to ordinary physics. That may be the strangest thing about the places in Adventure Time. The series doesn't just give Finn a large world to explore, it gives him multiple kinds of worlds, and they don't all obey the same definition of reality. Once you understand that, traveling across U becomes more than moving from one kingdom to another. Every new location has the possibility of revealing another layer of how the universe works. And some of those locations are especially important because they connect directly to the deepest mysteries of the series. Places like the Time Room, the Night Sphere, and the various realms of the afterlife aren't just interesting settings. They provide evidence that the world of Adventure Time is much larger than the physical landscape Finn spends most of his life exploring. The strange places of U, therefore, are not just places where strange things happen. They are part of the explanation for why U is so strange. The world was shaped by catastrophe, magic, ancient beings, reincarnation, technology, and forces that existed long before Finn arrived. Once you start looking at the locations instead of only the characters, the history becomes easier to see because the landscape itself is carrying evidence of everything that happened before. And that leaves us with another question. If U contains so many hidden worlds, forgotten civilizations, supernatural realms, and impossible locations, how many of the things we see are actually understood by the people who live there? The answer, in many cases, is surprisingly little. Even the characters who have lived for centuries don't necessarily understand the full history of their own world, and some of the most important places in Adventure Time remain mysterious even after the series gives us pieces of their story. That is why exploring U never really feels like reaching the end of a map. There is almost always another door, another ruin, another hidden room, or another place that exists just beyond what the characters thought was possible.
Adventure Time has so many unusual creatures that calling them monsters doesn't really cover what is happening in U. Some creatures are dangerous, some are intelligent, some are completely harmless, and some are so strange that the show never bothers giving them a proper explanation. What makes them especially interesting is that the series doesn't separate its creatures into neat categories. A creature can look like a monster and turn out to be a normal citizen, while something that looks cute can have an incredibly disturbing history. In U, appearance tells you surprisingly little about what something actually is. The Candy People are probably the best example because they look like one of the least threatening populations imaginable. They are living pieces of candy, and many of them have personalities, jobs, relationships, and individual histories. At first, that seems like a simple visual joke, but once Princess Bubblegum's history is revealed, the existence of the Candy People becomes much stranger. They aren't simply a species that evolved naturally over thousands of years. Many of them were created or influenced by Bubblegum, which means an enormous part of U's population exists because one immortal scientist decided to build a society. That makes the Candy Kingdom unusual on a biological level. Most civilizations develop through generations, but the Candy Kingdom has been shaped by a creator who can directly modify the people living inside it. Bubblegum can create candy organisms, alter their bodies, repair them, and even develop entirely new forms of life. This means the citizens aren't only a population, they are also evidence of Bubblegum's scientific experimentation. The cheerful appearance of the kingdom hides the fact that its ruler has extraordinary control over the biology of her people. Nettie is one of the stranger examples because he appears to be a massive candy creature living beneath the Candy Kingdom. His appearance is unusual even by Adventure Time standards, but his behavior is relatively simple. What makes him interesting is that Bubblegum's relationship with him shows that not every creature she creates is intended to participate in normal society. Some beings are simply part of the Candy Kingdom's biological ecosystem, even when they are far too large or strange to interact with ordinary citizens. The Gumball Guardians are another example of how unusual Bubblegum's creations can be. These enormous pink guardians protect the Candy Kingdom and function almost like living security systems. They look like giant candy figures, but their physical powers far beyond what their appearance suggests. They can destroy threats and protect the kingdom without behaving like ordinary people. Their existence raises the same question that follows Bubblegum throughout the series. Where exactly is the boundary between creating a machine and creating a living creature? Then there are the lumpy space people, who seem simple until you examine their biology. Lumpy Space Princess is technically a different species from Thin, Jake, and the Candy People, but her body doesn't follow ordinary physical rules. She can float because of her lumpy physiology. Her appearance can change under certain circumstances, and her species seems to exist according to a completely different biological system. The lumpy space people also have their own society and culture, suggesting that Ooh isn't just populated by random magical creatures. Entire species can develop their own communities without the series ever explaining where they came from. The Lich is obviously one of the most important creatures in the series, but what makes him interesting is that he doesn't behave like a normal species at all. He appears as an individual embodiment of death and destruction, yet his existence is connected to cosmic forces that are much larger than Ooh. He isn't simply an undead wizard who became powerful through training. His origins are tied to the extinction of life itself, which makes him fundamentally different from most villains Finn encounters. The Lich also demonstrates how Adventure Time can turn a physical creature into an abstract concept. He has a body, a voice, and a recognizable personality, but his actual purpose goes beyond those things. He exists to end life. That is why his presence feels so different from an ordinary villain. Defeating him physically doesn't necessarily eliminate the idea or force he represents, especially once the series begins exploring multiple realities. Glob is another creature that doesn't fit easily into any normal category. Before becoming part of the mythology surrounding the ancient Martians and cosmic history of Ooh, Glob is presented as a powerful supernatural figure associated with the old world. The story of Glob demonstrates that Ooh's mythology includes beings that were worshipped, remembered, or treated as gods long before Finn's time. Their exact nature is often deliberately vague, leaving room for the possibility that what characters call gods may simply be extremely powerful beings from an older civilization. The Martians complicate this even further. They are intelligent extraterrestrial beings with technology and social structures that have almost nothing to do with the civilizations of Ooh. Their existence proves that the world of Adventure Time isn't limited to Earth, and that the supernatural and science fiction elements of the series can coexist without explanation. Characters can travel into space, encounter alien civilizations, and return to Ooh without the story needing to become a science fiction series. One of the most memorable alien creatures is the cosmic owl, although calling him an alien doesn't fully explain what he is. He appears in dreams and is connected to cosmic events involving reincarnation and fate. His presence suggests that certain creatures exist outside ordinary biological categories altogether. The owl's connection to dreams is particularly strange because dreams in Adventure Time can contain information about events that have not happened yet. That means the cosmic owl can potentially interact with characters before they understand why the encounter matters. His appearance in a dream can become part of a larger chain of events that only make sense much later. In this way, the creature isn't simply living somewhere in the universe. He is connected to the structure of destiny itself. The vampires of Ooh provide another strange example because they aren't all the same. Marceline is the most important vampire in the series, but her abilities come from a complicated combination of her biology, her experiences, and the vampire essence she gains. Other vampires have their own powers and characteristics, creating what feels like an entire supernatural ecosystem rather than one uniform species. Marceline's ability to absorb the essence of other vampires eventually gives her additional powers, making her history part of the reason she becomes so unusual. The Vampire King story also shows how Adventure Time can treat monsters as characters with philosophies rather than simple instincts. He doesn't simply want to attack humans because he's a vampire. His worldview is shaped by his understanding of immortality and his relationship with death. Marceline's eventual rejection of certain aspects of vampirism therefore becomes a conflict over what it means to live forever, rather than simply a battle between good and evil. The Fire People are another species whose biology is difficult to understand. Flame Princess and the inhabitants of the Fire Kingdom are made of living flame, yet they have physical bodies, personalities, political systems, and relationships. They can be affected by water, but they can also interact with ordinary objects and environments. Their existence raises obvious questions about how they reproduce, how they maintain physical form, and what exactly their bodies are made from. Adventure Time rarely answers those questions because the Fire People don't need to be biologically realistic to function in the story. Their purpose is partly to explore how different forms of life can coexist. Finn can fall in love with Flame Princess even though their bodies obey completely different rules. Their relationship becomes complicated not because one of them is secretly human, but because their fundamental natures create genuine problems. The Ice Thing and the various beings connected to the Ice Crown create another category of creature, characters whose bodies are altered by magical artifacts. The crown can transform its wearer, and Simon's gradual transformation into the Ice King shows how deeply a magical object can affect someone's identity. The Ice King isn't simply a man wearing a powerful crown. Over time, the crown changes his memories, personality, and behavior until the original Simon becomes increasingly difficult to recognize. This makes the Ice King one of the most tragic creatures in the series, because his monstrous appearance is not the result of an evil nature. He is a human being who has been altered by an artifact that he originally used for a protective purpose. The creature that Finn sees is therefore the result of a long process rather than a single transformation. Fern creates an even stranger case because he is effectively a new person formed from Finn's own grass sword. Fern looks like Finn, behaves like Finn in some ways, and carries elements of Finn's personality. But he isn't simply a clone. His existence comes from a combination of magic, Finn's connection to the sword, and the supernatural properties of the grass demon. This creates a creature whose identity is built around someone else's identity. Fern's story is particularly interesting because it raises the question of whether being similar to someone makes you the same person. He looks like Finn, but he has his own experiences, emotions, and eventually his own sense of resentment. The show doesn't treat him as a disposable copy. He becomes a separate individual, which makes his existence one of the strangest examples of identity in Adventure Time. The lemongrams are another case where the biology of a creature is secondary to its creation. They are candy beings created by bubblegum, but their personalities are so unusual that they become almost impossible to categorize. Their relationship is deeply uncomfortable at times because they are essentially isolated rulers with enormous authority and very little understanding of how normal social interaction works. Their bodies are simple lemon shapes, but their behavior can become some of the strangest in the entire Candy Kingdom. What makes the lemongrams interesting is that their problems are not caused by being physically monstrous. They are caused by the way they were created and raised. Bubblegum gives them authority over a kingdom, but doesn't necessarily provide the emotional foundation they need to use that authority responsibly. Their story becomes an example of how creating life doesn't mean you automatically understand how that life will develop. The snail is much less powerful, but almost as mysterious. The tiny snail appears repeatedly throughout the series, often hidden somewhere in the background. It's easy to treat the character as an Easter egg, but the snail's repeated appearances eventually become part of the show's larger mythology. The fact that the same creature can appear across so many unrelated situations suggests that it isn't simply random background decoration. The snail becomes especially memorable because of its connection to the lich. Its seemingly harmless appearance contrasts with the much darker significance of the character's actions. Adventure Time uses the snail as an example of how background details can become important later, encouraging viewers to pay attention even when something looks completely insignificant. Then there are creatures that exist almost entirely as jokes, but still reveal something strange about the world. The various talking animals of Oo suggest that intelligence isn't restricted to humans and magical humanoids. Birds, cats, dogs, pigs, deer, and other animals can speak, work, form relationships, and participate in society. Yet not every animal is intelligent, which means there is no obvious dividing line between ordinary animals and sentient ones. Jake himself makes that boundary even stranger because he is biologically unusual despite being a dog. His parents and origins connect him to a species with extraordinary abilities, meaning that the word dog doesn't really tell us much about what he is capable of. His body can transform, he can communicate, and he has abilities that no ordinary dog could possess. But socially, he is still treated as Jake rather than as some completely separate category of supernatural being. The various monsters encountered by Finn and Jake also demonstrate how little the series cares about conventional species classification. Some monsters are animals, some are magical beings, some are ancient entities, and some seem to exist solely because a particular place in Oo produces them. Finn can fight a giant creature in one episode and become friends with something equally strange in another. The moral status of a creature often has nothing to do with its appearance. This is especially important because Adventure Time repeatedly challenges the idea that monsters are inherently evil. Marceline looks like a vampire and can be terrifying, but she is also one of Finn's closest friends. Flame Princess is literally made of fire and can destroy enormous areas when her emotions become unstable, yet she is not evil. The Lich looks like a skeleton and is genuinely destructive, but his existence is tied to a much larger cosmic purpose rather than ordinary villainy. Even monsters that are dangerous have understandable motivations. The series often gives monsters personal histories, fears, or desires that make them more complicated than simple obstacles. This contributes to the feeling that Oo is a functioning ecosystem rather than a game level where monsters exist only to be defeated. And that brings us to perhaps the strangest creature category of all, beings that are difficult to distinguish from concepts. The Lich represents death. The cosmic owl is connected to dreams and fate. Prismo is connected to wishes and time. Orgalorg is an ancient cosmic entity that can take another form. These beings don't fit comfortably into biological categories because their identities are tied to forces larger than themselves. Adventure Time's creatures therefore reveal something important about the world. There isn't one system explaining why life exists in Oo. There are biological creatures, magical creatures, artificial creatures, cosmic entities, reincarnated souls, transformed humans, aliens, elementals, and beings that seem to exist somewhere between all of those categories. That is why the strangest creature in Adventure Time is often not the one with the most disturbing appearance. It is the creature that forces us to question what creature even means. A candy person can be artificially created but still have a genuine personality. A vampire can be immortal but still fear loneliness. A magical sword can become a person. A human can become an ice monster while remaining trapped somewhere inside the creature. A cosmic entity can appear in someone's dream and influence events in the physical world. And somewhere in the background, a tiny snail can keep appearing while the entire universe becomes increasingly complicated around it. The creatures of Oo aren't simply there to make the world look strange. They are one of the main ways Adventure Time explores identity, mortality, creation, and change. Once you start looking at them that way,
Even the most ridiculous-looking character can become part of the show's larger mythology. And after seeing how many different kinds of creatures can exist in Ooh, the next problem becomes obvious. If these beings can come from so many different sources, where did the strangest ones actually come from? Some have clear origins, some were created, some were transformed, and some appear to have simply existed long before anyone in the modern world knew enough to ask the question.
Adventure Time answers an enormous number of questions over the course of its run. But some of the most interesting mysteries are the ones that remain partially unexplained even after the finale. The series can give you enough information to understand that something is important, without ever giving you a complete explanation of what it is, where it came from, or why it exists. This is especially common with the older parts of Oo's history. The further back you go, the more the story becomes fragmented, and eventually you reach a point where even characters who have lived for centuries seem to be guessing about what happened before their time. One of the biggest examples is the exact origin of magic in Ooh. We know that magic exists, and we know that some forms of it are connected to ancient cosmic forces, but the series never gives us one definitive moment when magic entered the world. The Mushroom War clearly had enormous consequences, and the fallout from the catastrophe helped create the world Finn knows. But magic was not simply invented after the bombs fell. Ancient beings, magical artifacts, elementals, and supernatural creatures existed across different periods of history, and some of them appear to be older than the modern civilizations of Ooh. This means the Mushroom War explains part of the world's transformation, but it cannot explain everything. That distinction becomes important when looking at the Lich. His existence is associated with the destruction of life on a cosmic scale, and his story suggests that the forces behind him are much older than Finn's world. If the Lich is an embodiment or agent of a force that existed before the current civilization, then the history of Ooh is only one small part of his story. The series gives us clues about his connection to the Catalyst Comet and to the larger universe, but it never sits down and gives us a complete history of how the Lich came to be. We understand what he wants, and we understand that he is extraordinarily old, but his exact origin remains deliberately mysterious. The Catalyst Comet creates another layer of questions because it seems to connect individual characters with a much larger cosmic cycle. The comet has appeared repeatedly throughout history, and its influence is associated with beings who can reincarnate into different forms. Finn himself is connected to this cycle through previous incarnations, such as Shoko and other lives revealed through the mythology of the series. The implication is that certain souls have been participating in the history of the universe for an extremely long time. What the show never fully explains is why these particular souls continue to return and what determines the form they take in each life. That leaves an especially interesting question about Finn. If Finn is part of a reincarnation cycle, how much of Finn is actually unique to his current life? His personality, memories, relationships, and experiences clearly belong to the person we know as Finn, but his soul appears to have existed before him. Shoko was not simply Finn in a different costume. She had her own life and personality, and yet the connection between them is real. Adventure Time seems to be saying that reincarnation doesn't erase individuality, but it also doesn't explain exactly where the boundary between one life and another should be drawn. The future introduces another version of this mystery through Shermie. By the distant future, Finn and Jake's era has become ancient history, but the world still produces new heroes who seem to occupy similar roles. Shermie is adventurous and curious, while Beth has her own connection to the heroic traditions of Ooh. The series doesn't explicitly tell us that Shermie is Finn reincarnated, and that distinction matters. The similarities could be the result of reincarnation, cultural memory, coincidence, or some combination of those things.
The show gives viewers enough information to consider the possibility without turning it into a simple answer. The exact history of the humans is another mystery that remains surprisingly incomplete. We eventually learn about the human colony on the island, and Finn discovers that humans did survive the Mushroom War in significant numbers. But that doesn't tell us everything about what happened to humanity across the rest of the world. We know the catastrophe was global enough to devastate civilization, but the series doesn't provide a complete map of human survivors. There could have been other communities scattered across the planet, and the absence of evidence doesn't necessarily mean those communities never existed. Finn's discovery of the island creates a strange contradiction in his understanding of humanity. He spends much of his childhood believing that he may be the last human, only to discover an entire society of people who have deliberately isolated themselves from the mainland. From Finn's perspective, the world was telling him one story and then suddenly revealing another. He wasn't the last human, but he was still unusual because he had grown up outside the human civilization that survived. The reason the humans left the mainland is also more complicated than simply saying they were afraid of the dangers of Oo. Their society became increasingly dependent on technology and protection, and Minerva eventually became part of a system designed to preserve humanity. The island civilization represents one possible response to the apocalypse. Instead of rebuilding the old world, isolate yourself and prevent the same catastrophe from happening again. Finn represents the opposite approach. He grows up surrounded by the strange new world and becomes part of it rather than trying to recreate the civilization that existed before. Princess Bubblegum's past contains another mystery that the series answers only gradually. How much responsibility should she bear for the Candy Kingdom's problems? We know she created many candy people and ruled them for centuries, but her methods are not always easy to classify as good or bad. She spies on her citizens, creates surveillance systems, experiments on living beings, and makes decisions without asking for permission. At the same time, she genuinely cares about protecting the kingdom and has repeatedly prevented disasters that would have killed thousands of people. The mystery isn't whether Bubblegum is secretly evil. She clearly isn't. The more interesting question is why someone who genuinely wants to protect people is willing to violate their autonomy so easily. Her history with Gumball helps explain some of this, because she has experienced what happens when her creations become independent and turn against her. But even after that history is revealed, the series leaves room for viewers to decide how much of Bubblegum's behavior is justified by the danger she faces, and how much is simply the result of her desire to control everything around her. Marceline has a similar mystery surrounding her immortality. We know she became a vampire after the Mushroom War and eventually absorbed the essence of the Vampire King. But her exact physical nature after all those transformations isn't always clearly defined. She can shapeshift into monstrous forms, consume the color red from living things, fly, survive enormous amounts of damage, and remain physically young for centuries. The show establishes enough rules for her powers to make sense within the story, but not enough to create a complete biological explanation. More importantly, Marceline's relationship with mortality remains complicated, even though she is extremely difficult to kill. She has lived through the destruction of civilization and watched countless people disappear, including Simon's gradual transformation. Her immortality isn't presented as a simple superpower. It is a condition that changes how she experiences relationships, because almost everyone she meets is likely to have a much shorter life. That makes her emotional distance in some episodes easier to understand, even when she doesn't explicitly explain it. Then there's the question of Simon himself. The series eventually explains how the crown transformed him, but the crown's ultimate origin remains strange. We know that ancient beings created or were associated with the artifact, and we know it has existed for an extraordinarily long time. But the exact chain of events that brought it into Simon's hands is only partly explored. Simon discovers it while searching for artifacts, and once he begins wearing it, his life changes permanently. The crown seems almost designed to create a tragedy. It gives the wearer enormous power while gradually destroying the person using it. That raises another mystery about the crown's apparent intelligence. At different points, it seems almost like an independent entity with its own behavior, while at other times it simply responds to the wearer. The Ice King believes in the crown's power and repeatedly uses it, but Simon's original personality still exists underneath the transformation. The exact relationship between the artifact, the wearer's mind, and the magical forces behind it is never completely defined. The Gum War and the history of the Candy Kingdom also contain unanswered questions about how much of modern Ooo is built on earlier civilizations. Bubblegum has existed for centuries, but the kingdom she rules is not necessarily the oldest society in the region. Other kingdoms and communities existed before her, disappeared, or changed over time. Some ancient structures seem to have no obvious connection to any modern civilization, suggesting that Ooo has gone through more cycles of expansion and collapse than the series ever shows us. This is where the show's timeline becomes particularly difficult. We know major events such as the Mushroom War, Marceline's childhood, Simon's transformation, the development of the Candy Kingdom, Finn's childhood, and the later adventures of the main characters. But between those major events are enormous amounts of history that the series only touches on briefly. We don't know everything that happened during those periods, which means there are enormous gaps in the history of the world. Those gaps are important because they prevent Ooo from feeling like a fully documented setting. There are civilizations that existed and vanished without the audience ever seeing them. There are characters who live for centuries without appearing in the main story. There are wars, migrations, discoveries, and disasters that are mentioned only indirectly. Even when the series gives us a date or approximate time period, there can be enormous amounts of history missing between the events we know. One of the strangest mysteries, therefore, is not a specific object or character at all. It is the amount of history that must exist, but is never shown. Imagine living in Ooo and finding an ancient building buried beneath a forest. You might know that it existed before the current kingdoms, but you would have no way of knowing everything that happened there. You could find a machine, a symbol, or an old weapon and make an educated guess about its purpose, but the people who created it would be gone. That is essentially what the audience does throughout Adventure Time. We are constantly discovering artifacts from a history that is only partially recoverable. This also explains why so many theories about Adventure Time can coexist without one of them necessarily being completely correct. The show intentionally leaves enough gaps for interpretation. A mysterious creature might have an origin that is never stated. A recurring symbol might have multiple possible meanings. A character's resemblance to someone from the past might be intentional reincarnation or simply a thematic connection. The series doesn't always force the viewer to choose one explanation. Perhaps the best example is the question of what Ooo actually is after all these transformations. Is it still Earth? Technically, yes. But culturally, biologically, geographically, and spiritually, it has become something almost unrecognizable compared to the world before the Mushroom War. Humans changed, animals changed, magic became part of everyday life. Ancient forces continued to exist. New kingdoms formed, old civilizations disappeared. Even death became part of a much larger system involving reincarnation and multiple levels of existence. So when Finn walks through Ooo, he isn't simply exploring a fantasy kingdom. He's living in the aftermath of thousands of years of history. And that is why some of Adventure Time's biggest mysteries are never really solved. The series can explain what happened to Simon, but not every detail of the crown. It can explain where Finn's mother lives, but not the entire history of humanity after the Mushroom War. It can establish reincarnation, but not completely explain why particular souls return. It can show us the distant future, but not everything that happened between Finn's death and Shermie's lifetime. The unanswered questions aren't necessarily holes in the story. In many cases, they are what make the world feel enormous. A perfectly explained universe would eventually have nowhere left to explore. Adventure Time instead gives us a world where every answer opens a larger historical window, and beyond that window are centuries of events that we may never see. That is also why some of the strangest mysteries tend to survive long after the episode that introduced them. The viewer isn't simply trying to remember what happened. They are trying to figure out how the pieces fit into a world that is deliberately larger than the story being told. And once you start thinking about those missing pieces, another possibility becomes hard to ignore. Maybe some of the strangest things in Ooh aren't mistakes or unexplained leftovers. Maybe they are evidence of stories that happened long before Finn was born, long before the Candy Kingdom existed, and in some cases, long before anyone alive in Ooh could remember them. One of the strangest things about Adventure Time is how easily it can make a horrifying idea look completely ordinary. The show can put a ruined city in the background, introduce a character who has been alive for hundreds of years, or have Finn casually walk past the remains of the old world without stopping to think about what happened there. Because the characters have grown up in this environment, many of these things are normal to them. To the viewer, however, the more history you learn, the more unsettling that normality becomes. Ooh is a world where apocalypse, death, mutation, magical possession, and extinction are not unusual events, and the people living there have simply learned how to continue living around them. The Mushroom War is probably the biggest example. For much of the early series, the ruins of human civilization are treated almost like scenery. Finn and Jake can enter an abandoned building, find an old machine, or discover a strange object without understanding that it may have belonged to a civilization that once covered the planet. The jokes and adventures keep the tone light, so it is easy to forget what a nuclear apocalypse actually means. Once you know the history, those ruins become much harder to ignore. Every abandoned highway, underground bunker, destroyed city, and rusting vehicle is evidence that millions of people once lived in the world Finn explores. What makes this even stranger is that Ooh doesn't seem to have developed a collective culture around remembering the disaster. There isn't a permanent memorial to everyone who died in the Mushroom War. There isn't the universal religion built around the catastrophe. Most people don't appear to spend their lives trying to recover the history of the old world. Instead, generations have grown up in the new environment, and the apocalypse has gradually become something that happened so long ago that it barely affects everyday life. That is understandable after 1,000 years, but it also means that the people living in Ooh have inherited an enormous amount of history without necessarily understanding it. Marceline is one of the few characters who cannot separate herself from that history. She was alive during the aftermath of the war, and her earliest memories are connected to a world that was already falling apart. She wasn't raised in a kingdom with schools, roads, and stable communities. She wandered through the ruins with Simon, trying to survive in an environment where the old systems of civilization had stopped functioning. This gives her character a completely different relationship with Ooh than Finn has. Finn sees a strange world full of possibilities because that is the only world he has ever known. Marceline remembers when that world didn't exist. That difference explains some of Marceline's behavior throughout the series. She can be playful, sarcastic, and adventurous, but she also carries an enormous amount of history that she doesn't always talk about. When she encounters something connected to her childhood, the tone can change immediately. A song, an object, or a location can bring back memories of Simon or the years after the war. The show doesn't need to explain her sadness every time, because the audience eventually understands that Marceline has spent centuries losing people. Simon represents another version of this problem. He remembers the old world, but his memories have been damaged by the Ice Crown. That means Wu contains a person who technically carries one of the most valuable historical records in existence, while simultaneously becoming less capable of accessing it. Simon knows things that almost nobody else can know, but the crown gradually removes his ability to communicate that knowledge. His transformation is therefore not only a personal tragedy, it is also the destruction of historical memory. This is one reason the relationship between Simon and Marceline matters so much to the wider mythology. Between them, they represent two different forms of memory. Marceline remembers the emotional experience of surviving the apocalypse, while Simon remembers the intellectual and cultural world that existed before it. Neither person has the complete picture, and both lose pieces of what they knew. The result is a world where history survives only in fragments. Princess Bubblegum creates a completely different kind of darkness because she has spent centuries trying to prevent chaos through control. Her kingdom is safe partly because she's constantly monitoring it. She creates surveillance systems, studies potential threats, develops weapons, and sometimes manipulates the people around her without telling them why. From the outside, the Candy Kingdom looks cheerful and harmless. Underneath that appearance is a government built around the fear that one mistake could destroy everything. Bubblegum's paranoia isn't entirely irrational. She has lived long enough to see civilizations fail, enemies appear, and magical disasters threaten Wu. She knows that the world can become dangerous very quickly. But her response creates its own problems, because protecting people and controlling people are not the same thing. The more she tries to eliminate every possible threat, the more she begins treating her citizens as variables that need to be managed. Her history with Gumball makes this especially complicated. Bubblegum creates beings who eventually become independent individuals, but she struggles with the fact that they can make decisions she doesn't approve of. Gumball's betrayal reinforces her belief that giving people too much freedom can create catastrophic consequences. The Candy Kingdom therefore becomes a reflection of Bubblegum's greatest fear, a society she built herself that could eventually become uncontrollable. The darkness of the storyline is not that Bubblegum is secretly a villain. It is that she has enough power to become dangerous while genuinely believing that she is protecting everyone. Adventure Time repeatedly explores this kind of moral uncertainty. The characters who cause problems aren't always evil. Sometimes they are trying to solve a real problem with methods that create new problems. The Ice King is another example. Early in the series, he appears to be a ridiculous villain who kidnaps princesses because he is lonely and obsessed with marriage. Once the audience learns about Simon, however, those actions become much harder to interpret as simple comedy. The Ice King's behavior is still absurd, but it is also the result of a damaged mind. He is a man whose memories and personality have been progressively altered by the crown. This creates an uncomfortable question about responsibility. How much responsibility should Simon have for what the Ice King does when Simon himself is barely present anymore? The series doesn't give a legal or philosophical answer. Instead, it allows both truths to exist. The Ice King causes real harm, but he is also a victim of the artifact that transformed him. Simon was a good person, but the person he became can still hurt others. The same complexity appears in the story of the Lich. Unlike Simon or Bubblegum, the Lich doesn't have a sympathetic motivation that explains his behavior. He genuinely wants life to end. But even his existence raises a disturbing question about the universe. If death is part of the natural order, why does the universe need a being whose purpose is to eliminate all life? The Lich appears to be more than an ordinary villain because his goal is not conquest or revenge. He wants existence itself to stop. That is why the Lich feels so different whenever he appears. Finn can defeat a monster, but defeating the Lich doesn't necessarily make the underlying problem disappear. The series repeatedly brings him back in different forms and different realities, suggesting that his existence is tied to forces that extend beyond one body. His physical form can change, but the destructive purpose remains. The darkest part of this is perhaps the fact that the Lich can sometimes speak calmly while describing enormous amounts of death. He doesn't need to scream or become physically aggressive. His worldview is simple and absolute. If life continues, the work is incomplete. That makes him one of the few characters in Adventure Time who genuinely represents an existential threat, rather than a normal antagonist. U's treatment of death becomes even stranger when you consider that the afterlife is real. Death isn't an unknown concept in this universe. Characters can encounter dead people, travel through afterlife realms, and eventually reincarnate. Yet the existence of an afterlife doesn't make death meaningless. People still grieve, they still fear losing each other, they still experience loneliness and regret. In some ways, knowing that the dead may continue to exist makes loss more complicated rather than less painful. You might know that someone you love still exists somewhere, but that doesn't mean you can simply talk to them whenever you want. The relationship has changed. The person you knew may have moved into another existence, and reincarnation can eventually separate them even further. Finn's relationship with Jake becomes the strongest example of this. For most of the series, the two brothers behave as though they will always be together. Their adventures reinforce that assumption. Even when they fight, the audience expects them to reconcile. Even when they are separated, they eventually find each other. Their relationship is one of the emotional constants of the show. But Together Again forces that constant to end. The episode works because it doesn't pretend that their bond can prevent death. Eventually, both of them live their lives, and eventually, both of them die. Their story continues in the afterlife. But even there, they eventually have to accept that they cannot remain together forever. Jake reaches a point where he is ready to move on, while Finn is still holding on to the relationship they had of life. The conflict is painful precisely because neither character is wrong. Jake isn't abandoning Finn. Finn isn't wrong for wanting more time. They simply reach different points in their journey. That is a surprisingly mature idea for a series that began with a teenage boy fighting monsters with a magical dog. Adventure Time also hides darkness in its treatment of identity. Characters can be transformed so completely that their original selves become almost impossible to recognize. Simon becomes the Ice King. Fern becomes a distorted version of Finn. Marceline changes through vampirism. Flame Princess is affected by her own elemental nature. The series repeatedly asks whether a person remains the same when their body, memories, or personality changes. Fern's story is particularly uncomfortable because he has memories and traits connected to Finn without actually being Finn. He looks at Finn and sees someone who has the life he believes should have belonged to him. That creates resentment that can't simply be solved by telling Finn that he is a different person. From Fern's perspective, the similarities are evidence of everything he has lost.
This makes Fern's eventual transformation into a plant creature especially significant. His body changes again, but his identity remains connected to the experiences he has accumulated. Adventure Time doesn't treat identity as something determined entirely by appearance. The character can change physically while remaining emotionally recognizable. The same concept appears with reincarnation. Shoko is not Finn, but Finn is connected to Shoko. That means identity can persist without memory. A soul can continue through multiple lives even when the individual person has no conscious knowledge of those previous lives. This is one of the strangest ideas in the series, because it suggests that some part of a person can survive even when everything that made them recognizable is gone. U also contains creatures that have been alive for so long that normal human concepts of history barely apply to them. Marceline has lived for centuries. Bubblegum has existed for a similar length of time. Cosmic entities can be even older. For these characters, 100 years isn't necessarily an unimaginable period. It can be one stage of their existence. That changes the meaning of historical events. For Finn, the Mushroom War is ancient history. For Marceline, it is childhood. For Simon, the world before the war was part of his adult life. For cosmic beings, even those events may be relatively recent. The same event, therefore, exists at completely different distances depending on who is looking at it. This is one reason Adventure Time can make the world feel so large without constantly showing new locations. The characters themselves carry different timelines. Talking to Marceline is like talking to someone who has personally witnessed a piece of history that Finn can only learn through stories. Talking to Bubblegum means speaking with someone who remembers centuries of political changes. Talking to the Ice King means dealing with a person whose memories are fragmented, but whose existence stretches back into the old world. The darkness is hidden in plain sight because none of this is unusual to them. To Finn, Marceline is simply his friend. To Marceline, Finn is another person she cares about who will eventually grow old and die. To Bubblegum, Finn is one of many people she has watched grow up. That imbalance creates an emotional reality that the show doesn't always discuss directly. There is another hidden darkness in Oo's history: extinction. The world contains many species and civilizations that are simply gone. Humans were nearly wiped out. Ancient kingdoms disappeared. Creatures that once existed may no longer have living representatives. Even magical systems can fade or become forgotten. The series rarely treats extinction as a single dramatic event. Instead, it appears as the background condition of the world. This is why the ruins matter so much. They are not just cool scenery, they are the physical remains of things that used to be normal. A city existed there. People lived there. They had jobs, families, entertainment, technology, arguments, and ordinary lives. Then something happened and all of it disappeared. Finn walks through those places because he doesn't know what they were. The viewer eventually learns. And that difference in knowledge is one of the quietest sources of darkness in Adventure Time. The show doesn't need to tell us that Oo is haunted by the past because the past is literally underneath its feet. Even the cheerful Candy Kingdom is built in a world where entire civilizations have vanished. Even the tree fort stands in a landscape shaped by events that happened long before Finn was born. Even the adventures that seem completely disconnected from history happen inside a world that survived an apocalypse. Once you see Oo that way, its humor becomes more interesting rather than less serious. The absurdity isn't evidence that the world has no serious history. It is evidence that life continued despite everything that happened before. People rebuilt. New species appeared. New kingdoms formed. Children were born who had no idea what their ancestors survived. That may be one of the central ideas of Adventure Time. The world doesn't stop being worth living in just because terrible things happened before you arrived. Finn inherits a broken world without understanding how broken it was. Marceline remembers the broken world and learns how to live in the new one. Simon loses his memory of the old world while becoming part of the new one. Bubblegum tries to control the new world because she remembers how easily civilization can collapse. And eventually, generations continue after all of them. The world survives, but it never completely forgets. And that brings us to another part of Adventure Time's darkness that is easy to overlook: the way the past keeps physically returning. Ancient beings can reappear. Old enemies can return in new forms. Reincarnated souls can become new heroes. Forgotten technology can become relevant again. A relic from thousands of years ago can suddenly become the most important object in a modern adventure. In Oo, history isn't dead. It is simply waiting somewhere beneath the surface until another character accidentally finds it. And once that happens, the cheerful world of Adventure Time can suddenly become something much older, stranger, and more dangerous than it first appeared. Adventure Time has one of the most detailed fictional worlds in animation, but that doesn't mean every part of OO fits together perfectly. In fact, the deeper you look, the more you start finding things that seem to contradict what the series tells us elsewhere. Sometimes the explanation is probably magic. Sometimes it is simply the result of the show changing over time. And sometimes there isn't a satisfying explanation at all. That is part of what makes OO so entertaining to analyze, because the series can establish a rule in one episode and then casually do something completely different several seasons later. One of the biggest examples is the question of what exactly happened to Earth after the Mushroom War. We know that the war devastated civilization, created the massive crater associated with the Candy Kingdom region, and transformed the planet into the world eventually called Oo. We also know that humans survived in various places, that technology continued to exist, and that enormous parts of the old world were simply abandoned. The problem is that the exact scale of the destruction is difficult to reconcile with what we see later. Some areas look like they were completely destroyed, while others contain remarkably intact buildings, machines, and infrastructure that should have been affected by the same catastrophe. This becomes even stranger when characters encounter old technology that still works after hundreds or thousands of years. Finn can find a machine from the old world and sometimes use it almost immediately, despite the fact that nobody appears to have maintained it for generations. In reality, most complex electronics would have enormous problems surviving that long without maintenance, especially in a world where the original civilization had collapsed. Adventure Time doesn't really care about that level of realism, but the result is that the old world seems to exist in a strange state, where civilization has completely disappeared while many of its most useful objects remain conveniently functional. The same problem applies to electricity. Modern-looking technology appears throughout OO, even though the civilization capable of mass-producing it is supposedly gone. The Candy Kingdom has advanced laboratories, robots, computers, surveillance systems, and weapons, while other parts of the world are still operating at a medieval level. That isn't necessarily impossible because Bubblegum is an extraordinary scientist, but it creates a very uneven technological landscape. One kingdom can have advanced science while another character is living in a wooden village and using a sword as their primary tool. Princess Bubblegum herself creates one of the biggest inconsistencies in the setting, because her scientific abilities are so advanced that they should completely transform the world around her. She can create artificial life, build machines, develop advanced weapons, manipulate biology, and understand technology that appears to be centuries ahead of ordinary OO. Yet, she doesn't simply industrialize the entire kingdom and create a modern society. Instead, the Candy Kingdom remains visually whimsical and relatively simple, even though its ruler possesses technology that could potentially revolutionize almost everything. There are practical reasons for this. Bubblegum may deliberately limit certain technologies because she understands their dangers, and she clearly prefers maintaining control over introducing inventions she cannot predict. But even that explanation doesn't account for everything. If one person has the ability to create advanced technology, why doesn't the rest of OO eventually learn from her? Why aren't there engineers traveling between kingdoms? Why doesn't her scientific knowledge spread more widely? The show never really treats technological development as something that follows normal rules. Magic creates an even bigger problem because its rules are often inconsistent. Sometimes magic requires enormous amounts of power, complicated rituals, or specific magical objects. Other times, a character can perform something equally impossible with almost no explanation. Finn can encounter a magical artifact that completely changes reality, while another episode treats magic as almost casual. There are wizards, witches, demons, elementals, cosmic beings, enchanted objects, and supernatural creatures, but the series never provides one unified system explaining how all of these powers work. This is especially obvious with magical artifacts.
The ice crown has specific abilities and consequences, but other objects apparently can grant wishes, change bodies, create life, alter dimensions, or manipulate time. Some objects seem to have limits, while others can do almost anything the story needs them to do. If all of these objects exist within the same universe, it becomes difficult to determine why one magical item is incredibly dangerous, while another is treated like an ordinary adventure tool. Finn's own sword collection creates another example. Throughout the series, he uses different swords that have completely different origins and properties. Some are ordinary weapons, some are magical, some are connected to Finn himself, and some become part of his identity. But the series doesn't always establish what happens to these objects between appearances. A sword can be destroyed, replaced, transformed, or simply disappear from the story, and the characters rarely behave as though maintaining a consistent inventory matters.
Finn's grass sword is especially complicated because it eventually becomes connected to Fern. The sword contains the grass demon, and its relationship with Finn creates consequences that are much larger than a normal weapon should have. But if the sword is capable of creating a living person through its connection to Finn, that raises questions about everything else Finn has interacted with. Why does this particular magical object have such a powerful relationship with him? Why does the grass demon choose him? And how exactly does a weapon turn into an independent person while retaining characteristics associated with Finn? The series gives us enough information to understand the basic story, but not enough to construct a complete set of rules. Jake's powers are another problem. His ability to stretch and transform his body is treated as a normal part of his character, but the actual limits of his abilities change depending on the situation. Sometimes he can become enormous. Sometimes he can create incredibly detailed objects with his body. He can transform into animals, tools, vehicles, and almost anything else the story requires. Yet there are also situations where he struggles with physical challenges that should theoretically be easy for someone with that level of control. His powers become even stranger after we learn about his father, Warren Ampersand. Jake isn't simply a normal dog who happened to gain magical abilities. He is connected to an extraterrestrial or supernatural species with unusual biology. That explains some of his abilities, but it also creates another problem. If Jake inherited those traits from Warren, why are his powers so different from the abilities we see in other members of the species? The series gives us pieces of an explanation, but Jake remains an unusually powerful example. Then there is the question of Jake's age. Jake and Finn grow up together, but Jake is biologically different from a human. He matures at a different rate and eventually has children of his own. Yet the series doesn't always maintain a clear relationship between his physical age and his emotional age. Sometimes he behaves like an older brother, sometimes like a teenager, and sometimes like an adult who has already experienced decades of life. This isn't necessarily a contradiction, but it does make his character difficult to place on a normal timeline. Finn has his own strange age problem. He is introduced as a 12-year-old and eventually grows into a teenager, but the amount of experience he accumulates is enormous compared with what a normal teenager would realistically have. He fights ancient cosmic entities, travels through alternate dimensions, meets civilizations that have existed for centuries, and becomes involved in political conflicts between kingdoms. The series intentionally treats him as an unusually capable young hero, but his childhood is still remarkably eventful. The most obvious issue, however, is the sheer number of dangerous things Finn survives. He falls from enormous heights, gets injured by magical creatures, encounters deadly weapons, enters hostile dimensions, fights beings capable of destroying entire kingdoms, and repeatedly gets himself into situations where an ordinary human should not survive.
The world of Adventure Time has a flexible relationship with physical consequences. Characters can be seriously injured in one story and completely fine later, while other injuries can become permanent and emotionally important. This creates an interesting distinction between cartoon physics and the deeper mythology of the series. When the story wants an injury to matter, it matters. Finn losing his arm is a major event. His relationship with his body changes, and the consequences affect his identity. But in other situations, characters can survive ridiculous amounts of damage because the episode is primarily focused on comedy. The universe, therefore, seems to operate according to two different systems depending on the tone of the story. Death itself has similar inconsistencies. Sometimes death is permanent and deeply emotional. Other times, characters return through magic, reincarnation, alternate realities, or supernatural intervention. Finn and Jake can die and continue existing in the afterlife, while other characters disappear from the story with little explanation. The existence of reincarnation makes the concept of death complicated, because a character may technically return, but the new incarnation isn't necessarily the same person with the same memories. That creates a strange situation with Finn's previous lives. If Finn is connected to Shoko and other incarnations, then his soul has existed before, but Finn himself has no normal memory of those lives. From a storytelling perspective, this is meaningful because it allows the series to connect characters across time. From a logical perspective, however, it creates a difficult question. What exactly makes two incarnations the same person? If memory isn't required, then perhaps identity is based on personality or destiny, but those qualities can also change. Shoko doesn't behave exactly like Finn, and Finn doesn't know that he was once Shoko. So perhaps the soul is the only constant. But if the soul is the only constant, then almost every character could theoretically be connected to previous lives in ways that the show never explores.
The future of Ooh creates another problem with population. The series shows a world full of humans, candy people, animals, monsters, elementals, vampires, wizards, aliens, and other species. Yet we rarely see large-scale population centers outside the major kingdoms. The Candy Kingdom is relatively small, and many villages contain only a few dozen people. If Ooh really contains an entire post-apocalyptic civilization spread across a huge region, the population appears surprisingly low. This might be explained by the Mushroom War and the long period of rebuilding that followed it, but even after centuries, some areas remain almost completely empty. There are enormous forests, mountains, deserts, and ruins with barely any permanent settlements. That makes Ooh feel less like a densely populated civilization and more like a collection of isolated communities separated by huge stretches of wilderness. And then there are the humans on the island. Finn spends most of his life believing he is the only human, but the human population on the island is large enough to sustain an entire technological society. The reason he doesn't encounter them is explained by their isolation, but the discovery still raises questions about how humanity survived elsewhere. If such a large population existed in one place, were there other hidden groups? Did humans deliberately avoid Ooh? Did some populations die out? Did they migrate to other continents? The series never gives us a complete answer. The geography of Ooh itself is also difficult to reconcile. Characters can travel enormous distances between episodes, but the exact scale of the continent is rarely consistent. Finn and Jake can leave the tree fort, visit another kingdom, have an adventure, and return without spending the amount of time that a realistic journey would require. Some locations seem to be relatively close together,
while others appear to be separated by huge distances. Mountains, deserts, forests, oceans, and kingdoms seem to move around depending on what the story needs. This is partly a normal feature of animated adventure storytelling, but Adventure Time makes it more noticeable because the show eventually provides an actual map and enough lore to make geography important. Once the world has a history and a timeline, viewers naturally start asking how long it takes characters to travel between places. The answer is usually however long the episode requires. And honestly, that may be the most accurate explanation available. The same flexibility applies to language. Almost everyone in OO speaks the same language despite the existence of radically different cultures and species. Characters from the Fire Kingdom can communicate with humans. Candy people can communicate with humans. Demons, wizards, aliens, and supernatural creatures generally understand one another without translation. There are exceptions, but there is no consistent linguistic history explaining why so many civilizations, separated by geography and time, share the same language. Again, magic could explain some of it. The universe clearly contains supernatural communication, but the show rarely establishes that everyone is magically translating speech. Most of the time, language simply works because the story needs it. There's also the strange question of why so many characters understand modern references. Finn doesn't live in the old human world, yet characters can encounter artifacts and concepts that are clearly connected to our civilization. Sometimes they understand what an object is, and sometimes they have no idea. The inconsistent level of historical knowledge makes sense if knowledge was lost unevenly, but the series doesn't always make that distinction clear. Perhaps the biggest doesn't make sense problem is that OO's world is simultaneously ancient and modern. Characters live in medieval-looking kingdoms, but they can find cars. They use swords, but there are computers. They live in castles, but there are robots. They encounter wizards, but also spaceships. There are princesses and kings, but there are also scientific laboratories capable of advanced genetic engineering. The world shouldn't fit together. And yet, that contradiction is basically the identity of Adventure Time. The series isn't trying to create a realistic post-apocalyptic civilization. It is creating a world where every piece of fantasy, science fiction, comedy, mythology, and childhood imagination can coexist. The inconsistencies are sometimes genuine continuity problems, but they are also part of why OO feels so unpredictable. The strange thing is that the more lore Adventure Time gives us, the more these contradictions stand out. At first, OO is just a weird place where anything can happen. Then we learn about the Mushroom War. Then we learn about the ancient civilizations. Then reincarnation becomes important. Then we discover alternate dimensions. Then we meet cosmic beings. Then we see the distant future. And eventually, the viewer realizes that the world was never designed to have one simple explanation. It is a collection of histories that collided. That may be why trying to make every single detail perfectly logical can sometimes miss the point. Adventure Time is interested in what happens when a world survives long enough for its old rules to become buried under new ones. The Candy Kingdom can sit on top of ancient ruins. A magical creature can live next to a piece of pre-war technology. A reincarnated hero can grow up without remembering who they were before. A teenager can become involved in conflicts that began centuries before his birth. It doesn't always make sense, but it does create the feeling that OO has been changing for a very, very long time. And once you accept that, the contradictions themselves become another part of the mystery.
One of the reasons Adventure Time can feel almost impossible to fully understand is that its strangest details rarely exist by themselves. A character introduced as a joke can eventually become connected to an ancient civilization. A location that looks like nothing more than a background detail can turn out to be part of a much larger system. A seemingly ordinary object can have a history stretching back thousands of years. The series is constantly connecting things that initially appear unrelated, and when enough of those connections accumulate, Ooh starts to feel less like a collection of random ideas and more like a world where almost everything has a history. The best example is probably Finn himself. When the series begins, Finn appears to be a fairly straightforward character. He's a human teenager who wants to be a hero, he lives with Jake, and he spends most of his time helping people around Ooh. There is nothing in the earliest episodes that requires the viewer to know about reincarnation, cosmic entities, ancient civilizations, or the history of humanity. But as the series progresses, Finn becomes connected to almost every major layer of the world's mythology. His family history connects him to the surviving humans, his past lives connect him to reincarnation, his relationships connect him to several kingdoms, and his adventures eventually bring him into contact with beings operating on a cosmic scale. The connection between Finn and Shoko is especially important because it changes how we understand the character without changing the person he is in the present. Shoko lived centuries before Finn, and her life is completely different from his. She doesn't have his memories or his relationships, and she doesn't grow up knowing that another version of herself will eventually appear. Yet the series establishes that they are connected through reincarnation. This means Finn's story isn't necessarily beginning when he is born. In a strange way, he is stepping into a story that has already been happening for much longer than he realizes. The idea becomes even more interesting when the series introduces other reincarnations. The pattern suggests that Adventure Time's heroes and villains can continue interacting across enormous periods of time without knowing that they have done so before. A conflict that appears to belong to one generation can effectively continue into another because the souls involved return in new forms. The characters change, the world changes, and the circumstances change, but certain relationships keep resurfacing. That gives the distant future of Ooh a completely different meaning. When Shermie and Beth appear, they aren't simply there to show that Finn's world has disappeared. They demonstrate that the cycle of heroes continues. The world has changed dramatically, but someone is still wandering through it looking for adventure. The names are different, the civilization is different, and the technology is different, yet the basic role remains recognizable. The series never completely confirms that Shermie is Finn reincarnated, and that ambiguity is important. It could be reincarnation, cultural repetition, or simply a deliberate parallel. But whichever interpretation you prefer, the connection is still there. Adventure Time repeatedly suggests that certain patterns survive even when individual civilizations don't. The same thing happens with Marceline and Simon. Their relationship begins in the aftermath of the Mushroom War, but its importance reaches all the way into the present. When Simon first encounters Marceline, she is a child trying to survive in the ruins of the old world. He becomes a caretaker for her, and she develops an attachment to him that lasts for centuries. The tragic part is that Simon gradually disappears while Marceline remains. The same two characters who once depended on each other eventually become almost strangers because one of them loses his memories. This creates a connection between the old world and the modern world that is almost impossible to reproduce through ordinary history. Simon doesn't simply know about the apocalypse, he lived through it. Marceline doesn't simply study ancient civilization, she remembers being there.
Their memories turn history into something personal. The Ice Crown connects these two characters even more strongly. Simon discovers the crown before his transformation, but the artifact eventually becomes responsible for separating him from Marceline. The artifact itself, therefore, becomes part of their relationship. It isn't just an object that creates the Ice King, it is one of the reasons Simon becomes someone Marceline can no longer recognize. Then, centuries later, Finn becomes involved with the Ice King without initially knowing who he really is. That is one of the most interesting circles in the entire series. Finn meets the Ice King as an enemy. Marceline remembers Simon as someone who protected her. Simon remembers Marceline as the child he cared for. And eventually, Finn becomes one of the people trying to help restore Simon's identity. A single relationship therefore connects three different periods of Oo's history.
The same pattern appears with Princess Bubblegum. At first, she seems to be simply the ruler of the Candy Kingdom, but her history eventually reaches back hundreds of years. She isn't merely a princess who inherited a kingdom, she is one of the beings responsible for creating the civilization she rules. Her relationship with Gumball, Nettie, the Candy People, and other creations shows that the kingdom itself is connected to her personal history. This makes the Candy Kingdom a very unusual place because its ruler is also effectively one of its ancestors. Bubblegum isn't just governing a society, she helped create its population. Her relationship with the Candy People, therefore, contains an unusual mixture of political authority and parental responsibility. That connection also explains why Bubblegum reacts so strongly when her creations become dangerous. When Gumball turns against her, the conflict is not simply between two political leaders, it is between beings whose history is directly connected. Bubblegum created him, but she cannot control what he becomes. Her struggle with him is therefore part of the larger question that follows her throughout the series. When you create another person, how much responsibility do you have for the choices they eventually make? The Candy Kingdom also connects to the old world through science. Bubblegum's laboratories contain technology that would be impossible for most inhabitants of Oo to reproduce. That means the ancient human civilization didn't disappear completely. Some of its scientific ideas survived, either through artifacts, recovered knowledge, or individuals like Simon and Bubblegum who continued experimenting after the collapse. This creates an unexpected connection between the Mushroom War and the Candy Kingdom. On the surface, they represent completely different worlds. One is a destroyed human civilization, while the other is a colorful fantasy kingdom populated by candy people. But both are part of the same technological history. The old world produced the knowledge and tools that helped shape the new one. The same is true of the Ice Kingdom. The Ice King's castle looks like a traditional fantasy location, but its existence is directly connected to a 20th or 21st century human archaeologist. The kingdom is therefore built around the consequences of an old world artifact. What looks like medieval fantasy is actually the result of modern human technology interacting with magic. This mixture appears everywhere in Oo. A sword can contain a supernatural entity. A laboratory can contain candy people. A ruined city can contain ancient technology. A dream can contain information about the future. A human can be reincarnated as another person. A cosmic being can appear inside a dream. A dog can have children with supernatural abilities. The boundaries between categories are constantly being crossed. Jake's family is another example. Jake believes he is a dog, and socially that is how everyone treats him. But Warren Ampersand reveals that Jake's abilities come from a much stranger origin. Warren is connected to an extraterrestrial species with the ability to alter bodies and possess unusual powers. Jake's existence, therefore, connects the ordinary world of Oo to a much larger universe. That becomes even more significant because Jake's children inherit some of his unusual traits.
They aren't simply normal dogs with slightly magical abilities. They represent the continuation of a completely different biological lineage inside Oo. Kim Kil-won, Charlie, TV, Viola, and the others have their own lives and personalities, but their existence proves that Jake's strange biology isn't just a one-time anomaly. This creates another example of Adventure Time's long-term storytelling. Something that seemed like a joke about Jake's family can eventually become evidence that the world contains entire species and histories that Finn knows almost nothing about. The connection between Oo and outer space becomes even clearer through Orgolorg. Gunter, who appears to be an ordinary penguin, is eventually revealed to have been hiding the identity of an ancient cosmic entity. This is one of the most extreme examples of the series disguising something enormous inside something completely ordinary. For a long time, Gunter is just Gunter. He follows the Ice King around, he gets involved in ridiculous situations, he behaves like a strange little penguin. Then, the series reveals that the creature inside that harmless-looking body is connected to a much larger cosmic history. This works because Adventure Time constantly teaches the viewer not to assume that appearance tells you what something is. A penguin can be a cosmic entity. A candy person can be a scientist's creation. A teenage boy can be part of an ancient reincarnation cycle. A normal-looking artifact can contain enough power to destroy a civilization. The recurring snail works in a similar way, although on a much smaller scale. The snail appears throughout the series in the background, often without any reason for the viewer to pay attention. Eventually, its connection to the Lich becomes an example of how small details can have unexpected consequences. The snail isn't powerful because it looks important. It becomes important because the series has been quietly placing it in the world over and over again. This is one of the most effective tricks Adventure Time uses. It trains the viewer to look at background details differently. Once you know that a seemingly meaningless character can become part of the mythology, you start paying attention to things that would normally be ignored. That changes the way the entire show feels. A symbol might matter. A strange object might have a history. A background character might return. A location might connect to something that happened hundreds of years ago. The audience starts exploring Oo the same way Finn does. You don't know which details are important until later.
The connection between the Lich and the Catalyst Comet works on a much larger scale. Finn and the Lich are not simply two characters who happen to fight each other. Their stories are connected through a cosmic system that existed before either of them. The comet represents a force that can influence the development of powerful beings, and both Finn and the Lich are connected to that larger cycle in different ways. This means their conflict isn't entirely accidental. They are participating in a much older pattern. That doesn't make Finn destined to defeat the Lich in a simple heroic sense. Adventure Time usually avoids that kind of straightforward prophecy. Instead, it suggests that certain forces repeatedly come into contact with each other because of the nature of the universe itself. The same principle appears in the relationship between Finn and Jake. They aren't connected because of some ancient prophecy. They become brothers because of circumstance. But over time, their relationship becomes one of the most important forces in both of their lives. In a universe full of reincarnation and cosmic destiny, Adventure Time also makes room for relationships that exist simply because two people chose to stay together. That is why Jake's death matters so much. There are cosmic systems that can explain reincarnation. There are magical objects that can alter reality. There are beings capable of manipulating time. But none of those things can completely replace a specific relationship. Finn can meet another incarnation. He can enter another reality. He can continue existing after death, but he cannot simply recreate the exact life he and Jake shared. That distinction gives the show's cosmic mythology an emotional limit. The universe may be enormous, but individual experiences are still temporary. Another important connection is between the elementals and the history of Oo.
The elemental forces aren't simply superpowers that certain characters happen to possess. They represent fundamental aspects of the world, and their influence can pass through different generations. Bubblegum, Slime Princess, Flame Princess, and Patient Saint Pym become connected to a much older system through their elemental identities. This suggests that the world has recurring structures that exist independently of individual characters. People change, kingdoms rise and fall, but certain forces return. That idea connects directly to the future of Wu. Civilizations disappear, characters die, species change, but patterns continue. The distant future isn't simply a completely different world, it contains echoes of the old one. The ruins of Finn's era remain. The idea of heroism remains. Reincarnation continues. Old artifacts survive. New characters discover ancient history. And somewhere in that future, the same questions are still being asked. What happened before us? Who were the people who came before us? Why does the world keep repeating certain patterns? Adventure Time never answers all of those questions because the point isn't to create a perfectly closed mythology. The point is to make the world feel as though it existed before the camera arrived and will continue existing after the story ends. That is also why the finale doesn't completely close U's story. The kingdom survives. New conflicts will eventually appear. New generations will grow up. New heroes will emerge. The characters we followed for years become part of history rather than the entire history of the world. And perhaps that is the biggest connection of all. Every storyline in Adventure Time eventually becomes someone else's past. Finn's adventures become legends. Jake's life becomes history. Marceline's memories become ancient stories. Bubblegum's kingdom changes. The Mushroom War becomes an archaeological mystery. The ruins of one civilization become the foundation for another, and even the mysteries we spend hours analyzing are eventually just pieces of a world that keeps moving. That makes Wu feel strangely realistic, despite how impossible almost everything in it is. Real civilizations work the same way. People experience events that seem enormous to them. Then generations pass and those events become stories. Buildings become ruins. Technology becomes obsolete. Languages change. Political systems disappear. Children grow up in worlds their grandparents would barely recognize. Adventure Time simply compresses that process into one enormous fantasy universe. The result is a world where everything seems connected because everything has a history. The weirdest creature can be connected to an ancient species. The strangest place can be connected to a forgotten civilization. A joke character can be connected to the cosmic mythology. A magical object can connect two people who lived centuries apart. A future hero can resemble someone from the distant past. And the teenager who thought he was simply the last human can eventually discover that his life is connected to the entire history of the planet. That is why Adventure Time remains so rewarding to examine long after the original story has ended. The show doesn't just give you answers, it gives you relationships between answers. One piece of information changes how another piece should be understood, and the further you follow those connections, the larger the world becomes. Eventually, you realize that Wu was never really a simple fantasy world. It is the remains of one world, the beginning of another, and the meeting point between several worlds that existed before either of them. And Finn's story is only a small part of it.